4,000 years ago, along the banks of the Nile, Egyptian priests wrote down warnings. Not warnings about enemy armies or plagues or famine. Warnings about beings that walked among humans disguised, watching, waiting. Beings with the heads of animals and the patience of gods. And here's what should keep you up at night, except this is a sleep story, so let it do the opposite. These beings weren't always described as living in some distant heaven. Sometimes they were described as living right here, hidden in plain sight, wearing the skin of something else. 12 of them appear again and again across thousands of years of Egyptian texts, tomb paintings and temple carvings. Some were protectors, quietly guarding households, while pretending to be nothing more than strange little statues by the door. Some were terrifying, moving through the desert dressed as storms, nobody could explain. And some, according to the oldest surviving papyrus scrolls, were so good at hiding that entire civilizations lived beside them, without ever fully understanding what they were looking at. Tonight we're ranking all 12, not by power, not by fame, but by how well they hid. From the ones that were almost obvious if you knew where to look, to the ones so well concealed that scholars still argue about whether it was ever meant to be seen at all. If you're listening to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit follow and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love reading those comments. It's wild scrolling through and seeing Cairo at midnight, Toronto at sunset, Sydney at breakfast, all listening to the same ancient warnings at completely different moments of their day. If podcasts are more your thing, the best way to support the show is by following on Spotify, listening there, and leaving a 5-star review if you're enjoying it. Links in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, let's start at the bottom of the list, with a being so strange, so oddly shaped, that the Egyptians decided the safest thing to do was to make him look adorable. Number 1 on our list. Bees, the household guardian. And if you're picturing something tall, imposing, maybe wrapped in golden shadow like the gods you're used to imagining, you're about to be surprised. Because bears broke every rule the Egyptians usually followed when they carved their divine beings into stone. Here's what made Bez strange from the very first glance. He wasn't tall, he wasn't slender, he wasn't depicted in that elegant profile that dominates almost every other piece of Egyptian art you've ever seen. The flat side view, the long limbs, the serene composed face, looking off into eternity. Bees was drawn facing forward directly at you, which was almost unheard of in Egyptian artistic tradition. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of years of art, kings and queens and gods all captured in profile, dignified, distant, looking sideways into the next world. And then there's Bez, staring straight out of the wall at whoever happened to be looking. Some historians think this alone tells us something important. He wasn't meant to be admired from a distance like a king on a throne. He was meant to be looked at eye to eye, the way you'd look at a face guarding your doorway. And what a face it was. Bez was carved with a wide, almost grotesque grin, a protruding tongue, sometimes sticking out in a way that seems almost comical to modern eyes, but was deadly serious to the people who carved it. His features were exaggerated, bulging eyes, a mane of hair, or a lion's ruff framing his face, ears that in some depictions looked distinctly animal rather than human. He had the body of a dwarf, short limbs, a large head relative to his body, a rounded belly. In some carvings he's shown bow-legged, almost squatting, as if frozen mid-dance or mid-leap. It's an appearance that doesn't fit neatly into any category. Not fully human, not fully animal, not clearly divine in the way Egyptians usually depicted their gods. Some Egyptologists believe this bizarre, almost cartoonish look wasn't an accident of artistic style, but a very deliberate design choice, one built entirely around function rather than beauty. In a culture obsessed with order, symmetry, and dignified representation, Bez was allowed to be ugly. Encouraged to be ugly even, because the ugliness had a job to do. The theory goes like this. Egyptian belief held that many dangerous forces, evil spirits, malicious ghosts, hostile entities that might slip into a home through the shadows could be frightened away by something even more frightening, or at the very least, something loud, chaotic, and startling. Bez's face wasn't designed to inspire awe the way a falcon-headed god, or a seated pharaoh might. It was designed to startle, to confuse, maybe even to make invading spirits recoil in shock the way a person might jump back from something unexpected in the dark. There's something almost playful about that idea, if you think about it. While Egypt's official state religion was busy building temples the size of mountains to gods with serene, composed features, ordinary households were relying on a squat, grinning, tongue-out figure to do the actual dirty work of keeping darkness away. Bez wasn't concerned with cosmic order or divine judgment. He was concerned with what was creeping around outside your window at night. And his body carried meaning too, not just his face. That dwarf-like form wasn't chosen randomly. In ancient Egypt, dwarfism carried associations that were far more complex and, in some ways, more respectful than you might expect from other ancient cultures. Individuals with dwarfism sometimes held positions of importance in Egyptian society, working as jewelers, entertainers, or overseers in royal households. There's evidence some were buried with considerable honour. So when Bez took on this particular shape, he wasn't being mocked or diminished in the eyes of the people who worshipped him. If anything, his unusual body may have been read as a mark of special power, a being who existed outside the ordinary proportions of the human world, and was therefore capable of standing at the boundary between our world and whatever waited beyond it. Some art historians point to his connection with lions as well. In certain depictions, Bez wears a lion's skin draped over his shoulders, or his facial features blend distinctly leonine characteristics into his human dwarf body, the mane-like hair, the flattened nose, the wide jaw. This blending wasn't unusual for Egyptian religious art, which frequently merged human and animal traits into single beings, but the specific combination in Bez's case, comic dwarf and fearsome lion, created a kind of walking contradiction, something both silly and threatening, something you might laugh at until you remembered exactly why it was standing at your door. By the time the New Kingdom rolled around roughly 3,500 years ago, Bez's image had become so recognizable that you didn't even need his full body carved to know who was being represented. Just the face was enough, that wide grimace, those bulging eyes, that protruding tongue, appearing on furniture legs, mirror handles, cosmetic containers, and the corners of buildings. He was, in a very real sense, everywhere, and yet he never fully looked like the powerful protector the Egyptians clearly believed him to be. That contradiction between how harmless he appeared and how seriously people treated his protective power is really where our story about hiding in plain sight begins. Because unlike some of the beings we'll get to later on this list, gods who disguise themselves in storms or crocodiles lurking silently beneath river water, or shadows that slipped between worlds unnoticed, Bez didn't hide his nature at all. He announced it, loudly, with a comically grotesque face plastered on nearly every doorway, bed frame and protective amulet across the ancient Nile valley. If anything, his disguise was the opposite of subtle. He hid by being unmistakable, so common, so instantly recognizable, that after a while people simply stopped questioning what exactly they were looking at every single day. Before we get further into how deeply Bez worked his way into everyday Egyptian life, it's worth mentioning something else you might find fascinating if ancient mysteries like this one keep you curious long after the video ends. There's a full book exploring 12 different unexplained mysteries from across history, similar in spirit to what we're covering tonight, available now on the website with a link down in the description if you want to dive even deeper once this episode winds down. Now back to Bez, and the question that made ancient Egyptians place his face in literally every room a child might sleep in. The answer is that Bez was not kept at a distance. He was invited in. Most Egyptian gods belonged to temples. Their statues were washed, dressed, fed, and honoured by trained priests behind walls that ordinary people might never cross. The great gods had processions, festivals, sacred lakes, incense burning in halls supported by forests of stone columns. But Bez lived somewhere else entirely. He lived where people slept, where they gave birth, where they got dressed in the morning, argued with relatives, worried about sick children, and listened to the strange noises of a house settling after dark. His image appears on the objects that gathered around the most vulnerable parts of daily life. Small faience amulets, glazed in blue or green, carried his face against the body. Tiny plaques placed him near beds. Furniture could be decorated with his features. Cosmetic jars and coal tubes bore his image. Even mirrors sometimes carried Bez on their handles, which makes a strange kind of sense. Every morning as someone looked at their own reflection, the guardian might have been there too, looking directly back. And these were not expensive temple statues made for kings. Many Bez amulets were small, portable, and probably available to people far below the level of the royal court. That matters. It suggests his protection was not reserved for the powerful. A farmer's family, a craft worker, a servant, a mother preparing for childbirth. All could have wanted a little piece of divine defence close at hand. Picture a small house in ancient Egypt, mud brick walls, a roof of timber, reeds and packed earth, heat trapped in the rooms during the day, then a sudden coolness after sunset, food stored carefully, water drawn from the Nile or a local well, everyone living close together, children sleeping near their parents, animals perhaps kept nearby too. It was home, but it was also a place where things could go wrong very quickly. A fever could arrive without warning. A pregnancy could become dangerous. An infant might stop breathing in the night. Scorpions could hide in dark corners. Snakes could enter from outside. And beyond the dangers people could see were the dangers they believed they could not see. Bad dreams, envious spirits, the restless dead. Forces that moved through darkness, illness, and bad luck. In that world, an amulet was not just decoration, it was a tool. Not a tool in the modern scientific sense, obviously. It could not cure an infection or guarantee a safe birth. But it gave form to a hope that otherwise had nowhere to go. You could hold it, wear it, hang it beside a bed, place it in the hands of a child. And by doing that, perhaps you made the invisible world a little more manageable. Bez was especially connected to sleep. The Egyptians did not necessarily think of dreams as harmless private movies playing inside the mind. Dreams could carry messages. They could expose a person to forces outside ordinary waking life. Night was a crossing point, when the familiar order of the day weakened and the unknown had more room to move. So Bez guarded bedrooms. Some objects associated with sleep carry his image alongside other protective figures and symbols. Bed legs could be shaped or decorated in ways meant to keep harmful things away from the sleeper above. Headrests, the curved supports Egyptians used in place of pillows, could bear protective imagery too. It sounds uncomfortable to us, sleeping with your neck balanced on a carved wooden rest, but these objects were more than furniture. They helped separate the sleeping person from the dangerous ground below, and when bears appeared on or near them, he may have served as a watchman through the long hours when everyone else had closed their eyes. There is something deeply human in this. Even now, people do small things before sleep that are not entirely rational. They check the locks twice, leave a hallway light on, Keep a familiar object near the bed. Ancient Egyptians had their own version of that instinct, except their nightlight had a grinning divine guardian with the face of a lion and the manners of a bouncer. Bez also stood close to childbirth, perhaps the most dangerous ordinary event in ancient life. Modern medicine makes it easy to forget how uncertain birth once was. For much of history, it was a moment balanced between joy and catastrophe. Mothers and babies faced risks that no prayer, charm, or careful preparation could fully control, which may be exactly why protection mattered so much. Women could wear amulets showing Bez during pregnancy or childbirth. His image appears in the wider world of birth magic, joined by other protective beings, especially the goddess Taweret. Magical wands, often made from hippopotamus ivory, carried lines of fierce divine creatures, intended to create a safe boundary around mother and child. Bez was one part of that defensive wall, not distant in some golden heaven, but right there in the room, assigned to the problem at hand. And domestic worship itself was probably quieter than the grand rituals carved on temple walls. There may have been a small household shrine, a figurine, a painted image, a spoken request before bed, before a birth, before a journey, or when a child fell ill. The evidence does not let us reconstruct every prayer or every private ritual. Ancient people did not always write down the things they whispered in fear. But the sheer number of household objects carrying Bez's image tells its own story. People wanted him near. That is why Bez ranks as the being who hid least of all. He did not become a shadow in the desert, or an animal waiting beneath black water. He became familiar. He became part of the furniture, part of the jewellery, part of the nightly routine. His greatest disguise was repetition. See the same guardian every day, on your mirror, your bed, your amulet, and eventually you may stop noticing the impossible idea behind him. A divine being stationed inside your home, watching the doorway while you sleep. But Bez was rarely alone in protecting the household. Near the bed of an expectant mother, in the charged and dangerous hours before birth, another guardian waited. Larger, stranger, and far less easy to laugh at. Number 2, Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus. If Bez was the small guardian you could almost imagine sitting on a shelf, Taweret was something much harder to domesticate. She had the broad head and heavy body of a hippopotamus, the paws of a lion, the tail of a crocodile, and a swollen belly. To modern eyes, she can look almost friendly. Round, upright, sometimes smiling, sometimes leaning on the protective hieroglyph known as Sa. Museum labels often describe her as cheerful, but that is partly because we have forgotten what the animals in her body meant to the people who lived beside the Nile. A hippopotamus was not a cartoon river horse. It was one of the most dangerous creatures in Egypt. An adult hippo can weigh more than a small car. It can move through water with shocking speed, then climb onto land and run faster than a person expects something that large to run. Its mouth opens wide enough to look almost absurd until you notice the teeth. The lower canines can grow into huge curved weapons. A hippo does not need claws, venom, or a complicated hunting strategy. It has mass, teeth, bad temper, and a very strong opinion about who belongs near its water. And ancient Egyptians knew this firsthand. The Nile was not simply a river flowing politely through a desert. It was the centre of life. People drank from it, travelled on it, fished in it, washed beside it, grew crops with its floodwater, and built settlements close to its banks. But the river also belonged to animals. Crocodiles moved beneath its surface. Snakes lived in the reeds, and hippopotamuses came out at night to feed. That last part mattered. A hippo might spend much of the day in water or mud, with only its eyes, ears, and nostrils breaking the surface. Then, after dark, it could leave the river and move into cultivated fields. One enormous animal could flatten crops, crush irrigation channels, and turn a carefully tended patch of grain into a mess of trampled stalks and mud. For a farming family living close to hunger, that was not an inconvenience. It was a disaster with legs. So picture a farmer hearing heavy movement outside after sunset. Not the light step of a goat, not the rustle of wind in reeds. Something bigger, something wet, something breathing hard in the darkness just beyond the field. You could not simply walk out and chase it away. That would be like trying to remove a bulldozer by shouting at it. Except the bulldozer has tusks and has already decided it dislikes you. The Egyptians hunted hippopotamuses, especially in royal imagery. Kings are shown standing in boats, driving harpoons into them. On one level, this was practical. Hippos threatened people and crops, but royal hippo hunts also became symbols. The king was not merely killing an animal, he was defeating a force of disorder, a dangerous wild power pressing against the cultivated world. That is important because Taweret takes this feared animal and does something strange with it. She does not erase its danger, she keeps it. Her hippopotamus head is not a soft, decorative choice. It carries the memory of riverbanks, crushed reeds, damaged fields, sudden violence, and a body so powerful that people had to treat it with caution. She was frightening because she was built from things that were already frightening. Then the Egyptians added more. Her hands and feet are often lion-like. Lions were not common companions in ordinary Egyptian villages, but they were familiar enough in the imagination of the Nile Valley as powerful predators, creatures of the desert edges, hunters with claws, teeth, and an unnerving confidence. A lion did not hide in the river. It belonged to another dangerous zone, the borderland where settled fields gave way to open country. And behind Taweret came the crocodile tale. Crocodiles were perhaps even more closely tied to daily anxiety. You did not always see them. That was the problem. A crocodile could disappear beneath brown water, silent and patient, while people crossed a canal, filled jars or brought animals down to drink. The Nile gave life, but it could also take it without warning. Egyptians respected crocodiles enough to worship the crocodile god Sobek in many places, but respect is not the same as affection. You can honour something precisely because you know what it is capable of doing. Taweret was a composite creature made from the Nile world's most alarming facts. Hippo, lion, crocodile. Not three gentle animals blended into a charming divine mascot, but three sources of force, appetite, teeth, and territorial rage. And that may be the key to understanding her. Ancient Egyptian religion did not always divide beings into simple categories of good and evil. A force could be dangerous in one context and useful in another. Fire burns houses, but it also cooks food. Floodwater destroys, but it also renews the fields. The frightening strength of a hippopotamus could be imagined not only as a threat, but as strength turned outward against other threats. If you enjoy these ancient mysteries, there is a book on the website about 12 unexplained mysteries, with a link waiting in the description. Because Taweret is exactly the kind of mystery that becomes stranger the longer you look at her. Why would anyone invite the image of a violent river animal into the private spaces of ordinary life? The answer begins with the Egyptians' understanding of defence. A guard who looks harmless may not frighten anyone away, but a guardian with a hippo's jaws, lion's claws, and crocodile's tail sends a clearer message. Nothing dangerous gets past this thing, and that is where Taweret's swollen belly becomes more than an unusual detail. It tells us exactly where all that terrifying power was believed to be directed. A pregnant body was a place of hope, but it was also a place of danger. For an ancient Egyptian family, pregnancy did not come with scans, emergency surgery, antibiotics, blood transfusions, or a doctor waiting behind a clean door. Most births happened at home, attended by female relatives, experienced midwives, and perhaps a local healer. Many went safely, but everyone knew that some did not. A difficult labour could become fatal quickly. Bleeding, fever, infection, a baby positioned wrong, a cord wrapped in the wrong place. Any one of these could turn a household celebration into mourning. And the danger did not end when the child arrived. Newborns were fragile. They had to breathe, feed, survive heat and cold, escape illness, and somehow make it through the first uncertain days of life. Modern people can forget how precarious infancy once was because we are used to a world where so many threats can be treated. In ancient Egypt, as in every ancient society, parents had very little control over the things that mattered most. They could prepare a room, they could call for help, they could make offerings, speak protective words, and keep watch through the night. But they could not guarantee that mother and child would still be alive by morning. That was Taweret's territory. Her rounded belly made the point immediately. She was not simply a powerful being who happened to look pregnant. Pregnancy was central to what she did. Taweret protected women through conception, pregnancy, labour, recovery, and the first dangerous period of a child's life. She was the divine presence called on when a family needed the most basic miracle imaginable. Let this birth go well, let the mother survive, let the baby cry. Let both of them remain here. The Egyptians surrounded childbirth with practical knowledge, but also with ritual protection. These were not separate systems in the way we might imagine. A skilled midwife could know what to do with her hands while also speaking an invocation. A family could prepare food, cloth, water, and a birthing place while setting out an amulet bearing Taweret's image. To them, the physical and the spiritual dangers were tangled together. If something terrible could enter a room without being seen, then protection also had to reach beyond what eyes could see. Small objects carrying Taweret's image have been found in domestic settings and burial contexts. Some were amulets, worn close to the body. Others appeared on items connected to women, children, cosmetics, and household life. Her image could be carved, moulded, painted, or pressed into faience, that bright blue-green Egyptian material that seems to hold a little of the Nile sky inside it. These were not giant temple statues meant to impress strangers from a distance. Many were small enough to hold, that matters. Taweret was not only a goddess of official ceremonies, approached by priests behind temple walls. She could be present in the intimate spaces of ordinary life, in the bedroom, near the childbirth area, in the hands of someone anxious about a pregnancy, in the possessions prepared for a baby who had not yet been born. There is something almost painfully human about that. People living thousands of years ago worried about the same terrifying questions that people worry about now. Will the labour be safe? Why is the baby not moving? Why is there fever? Why will the child not sleep? What do you do when you have done everything you know how to do, and you still cannot force the world to be kind? You ask for help. Sometimes Taweret appears alongside another protective figure, the dwarf god Bez. They make an unusual pair. Bez was noisy, comic, and confrontational, a guardian who frightened danger by making a spectacle of himself. Taweret was broad, maternal, and immovable. Together they represented a kind of divine household security system. One could imagine them standing at the invisible boundary around a mother and child, telling every hostile force, every sickness, every bad dream, every wandering spirit that this room was occupied. Move along. The Egyptians also used magical objects, sometimes called birth bricks. These were bricks associated with childbirth, because a woman may have crouched or knelt on bricks during labour. One surviving example from Middle Egypt shows protective divine figures, including Taweret, arranged around a central scene. The object is a reminder that birth was not treated as a private medical event alone. It was a threshold. The mother stood between danger and survival. The baby stood between non-existence and a human life. At a threshold you needed guards. Taweret could also appear on ivory wands, curved objects often decorated with protective beings. Egyptologists once called them magic wands, though they were probably used in rituals concerned with protecting mothers and infants. Their carved figures created a kind of boundary, not a wall you could see, but a line hostile forces were not supposed to cross. That is the quiet logic behind Taweret's presence. She was not comforting because she was harmless. She was comforting because she was powerful enough to be frightening on your behalf. And perhaps that is why she survived so well in the Egyptian imagination. Kings could claim the protection of great cosmic gods. Temples could honor gods who moved the sun and judged the dead. But a mother in labor needed someone closer. Someone who understood blood, fear, exhaustion, and the fierce determination to bring a child safely into the world. Taweret was a guardian for that moment, not distant, not abstract, not concerned only with pharaohs and monuments. She stood where life began, at its smallest and most vulnerable, and turned all her frightening strength toward keeping it safe. But birth was only the first threshold. According to the Egyptians, the moment a child entered the world, other powers were already waiting to shape what that life might become. Number 3. The Seven Hathors. Taweret guarded the dangerous crossing into life. But once a child had arrived, the Egyptians believed that life did not unfold in an empty universe. It unfolded under the attention of powers older than any family, powers that could appear in more than one form, in more than one place, and perhaps in more than one body at once. The Seven Hathors were one of those powers. At first the name sounds simple enough. Hathor was a major Egyptian goddess, one of the most beloved and widely worshipped beings in the entire Egyptian world. Her name is usually translated as the House of Horus, which may suggest the sky itself, the great dwelling place of the falcon god. But Hathor was never limited to one role. She could be a cow goddess, nourishing humanity with divine milk. She could be a woman wearing cow horns around a sun disk. She could be a celestial mother, a goddess of beauty, music, dancing, intoxication, love, and celebration. She could welcome the dead into the next world. She could protect travellers beyond Egypt's borders. She could appear as a fierce force when divine order was threatened. One goddess, many faces. And then in certain texts and stories, Hathor becomes 7. Not 7 completely separate goddesses with 7 unrelated names and personalities, more like 7 expressions of the same divine presence. 7 Hathors, 7 ladies, 7 manifestations of a power that was too large to fit comfortably into a single body. That idea would not have seemed strange to the ancient Egyptians. Their gods were not always fixed, individual characters in the modern sense. A deity could merge with another deity, take on a new form, change appearance according to place or ritual, or exist simultaneously in several local traditions. Hathor herself was connected to temples across Egypt, and each region could emphasize a slightly different side of her nature. In one place, she was a gentle mother, in another, a radiant sky goddess. In another, a patron of miners, desert expeditions and foreigners at the edge of the known world. The 7 Hathors may have gathered those many possibilities into one unsettling image. Imagine trying to greet a goddess whose identity was already broad enough to include the sky, the womb, the grave, the dance floor, the desert road, and the distant lands beyond the Nile. Now imagine that goddess arriving not alone, but multiplied. 7 faces, 7 voices, 7 pairs of eyes looking at the same human life. The number 7 mattered in Egyptian religious thought. though not always in one neat, universal way. Ancient cultures often treated certain numbers as meaningful because they helped organize the invisible world. 7 could suggest completeness, fullness, or a sacred set whose members acted together. Egyptians spoke of 7 sacred cows in some funerary contexts, providers of nourishment in the next life. There were groups of 7 protective beings, 7 gates, 7 powerful forces arranged around ritual ideas. So when Hathor appears sevenfold, the point may not have been arithmetic. It may have been abundance, divine attention made complete, and Hathor was exactly the kind of goddess people wanted near the beginning of a life. She was associated with women, fertility, nursing, sexuality, adornment, and the pleasures that made existence worth continuing. Her sacred instrument, the sistrum, was shaken in temples and ceremonies, its metallic rattle linked to joy, protection, and the calming of dangerous divine forces. Her face appeared on the handles of mirrors, on cosmetic objects, and on columns in temples. Her image could belong in royal spaces, but also in the personal world of grooming, music, childbirth, and affection. This was a goddess who moved easily between the grand and the intimate. She could belong to pharaohs. She could belong to miners working in the Sinai. She could belong to mourners at a tomb, and she could belong to an ordinary household, hoping that a new baby would thrive. That flexibility is important. The 7 Hathors were not imagined as distant cosmic machinery, turning above human heads where nobody could reach them. They were connected to one of the most vulnerable moments in any home. Their presence meant that the divine world was not merely watching from the sky. It was close enough to enter the room, close enough to be invited, or perhaps close enough to arrive whether anyone invited them or not. If you enjoy these strange corners of the ancient world, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with a link in the description. Because the deeper you go into Egyptian belief, the more you realize that their world was filled with beings who were never entirely absent. They could be honored in temples, carried as amulets, painted on objects, named in spells, and encountered at the turning points of a human life. Hathor's sevenfold form captures that feeling perfectly. She was not only one beautiful goddess, smiling from a temple wall. She was potentially a gathering, a divine assembly, wearing the face of joy and motherhood, but carrying knowledge no ordinary person possessed. The Egyptians did not necessarily see contradiction in this. The same goddess who brought music and celebration could also stand near danger. The same power that welcomed a child into the world could understand how fragile that welcome really was, and that may be why the 7 Hathors were remembered with such unease. They did not come as monsters. They did not need claws, fangs, or a terrifying animal form. Their power was quieter than that. They could appear in a shape that was familiar, beautiful, even comforting. 7 women, 7 divine presences, 7 aspects of Hathor gathered around a moment no one could fully control. And when they arrived, according to Egyptian tradition, they were not merely there to bless the child. They came to speak. In Egyptian stories, the 7 Hathors were said to appear at a child's birth and announce what kind of future waited ahead. Not every surviving text explains exactly how this happened. We do not have a neat handbook listing the words they used in every household, but the basic idea is clear enough. A baby had entered the world, and 7 divine witnesses could look beyond the small, helpless body and see the shape of the life waiting for it. They might pronounce a future of wealth or hardship, or an early death. They might reveal the danger that would one day come looking. And this was not a prediction in the casual, modern sense. It was not like saying rain might arrive next week. Their words carried weight because they came from Hathor, a goddess connected to birth, womanhood, nourishment, and the great cycles that carried people from life toward death and beyond it. The most famous example appears in an ancient Egyptian story now called The Tale of the Doomed Prince. A king and queen have long wanted a child. Finally, a son is born. It should be a moment of uncomplicated relief. A royal heir, a future king, a child whose arrival promises that the kingdom will continue. But then the Seven Hathors appear. They look at the newborn prince and announce that he is fated to die because of a crocodile, a snake, or a dog. Imagine hearing that. Not a vague warning, not an uncomfortable dream. 3 specific threats, each one waiting somewhere in the future. The king reacts as any frightened parent might. He decides that the prophecy must be defeated through control. The prince is kept away from the dangers named by the goddesses. He is placed in a remote house in the mountains, surrounded by servants, separated from the ordinary risks of Egyptian life. No riverbanks where crocodiles wait beneath the water. No open ground where snakes could hide, and certainly no dogs. For a while it seems possible. Maybe fate is just a problem of careful planning. Maybe if a king builds high enough walls, employs enough guards, and removes every dangerous thing from his son's path, the divine verdict can be made irrelevant. But the story understands something most parents understand too. You cannot keep a child in one room forever. The prince grows older. He sees other people living freely. He asks why he is imprisoned. Eventually he is allowed to leave, though his father still tries to manage the threat, and then almost immediately the first problem arrives in the most human way possible. The prince sees a man with a dog. He wants one. His father had tried to exclude the animal from his entire life, but the prince chooses it for himself. That detail is almost cruel in its simplicity. The danger does not always break through the walls. Sometimes it is welcomed inside because the person protected from fate does not know what fate looks like. The prince travels. He proves himself. He meets a princess. He gains a life beyond the confinement designed for him. And at several points, the prophecy seems ready to come true. A snake enters the story. A crocodile waits in the water. The dog remains close. But here's where the Egyptian tale becomes more interesting than a simple lesson about doom. The prince does not merely wait to die. Other people intervene. His wife helps save him from the snake. In some versions and interpretations, the dangerous creatures become entangled in struggles beyond the prince's control. The story survives in a damaged state, with its ending missing, so we cannot say with certainty how ancient listeners understood the final outcome. Did he die exactly as foretold? Did he escape one danger only to meet another? Did the story leave the question unresolved on purpose? We do not know, but perhaps that uncertainty is the point. The Seven Hathors could announce fate, yet Egyptian religion was not built around passive surrender. Egyptians used prayers, offerings, protective amulets, healing spells, and ritual knowledge because they believed danger could be pushed back. Not always removed, not always permanently, but resisted. They had words for forces connected to destiny. Shai could represent a person's allotted fate. Reina-Nutet was associated with fortune, nourishment, and the course of life. Meskenet, a birth goddess, could be linked to the destiny given at birth. These powers did not make existence feel predictable. They made it feel structured, like a river with currents already moving beneath the surface. You still had to steer. A prophecy from the Seven Hathors may have told a family that a danger existed. It did not necessarily tell them that every action afterward was meaningless. The king's desperate confinement fails to create safety. But the prince's courage, his relationships, and the help he receives all matter. Fate is present, so is choice, so is divine protection, so is sheer luck. That is a surprisingly modern kind of anxiety. People want to know what awaits their children, They want warnings early enough to prevent pain. They want certainty, even when certainty is terrible. The Egyptians gave that fear a face. 7 Hathors entering the room after a birth, beautiful and powerful, carrying knowledge the family could not possess. And perhaps that is why they hid so effectively. They did not hide in deserts, tombs, or dark waters. They hid in the future, in every accident not yet happened, in every choice that seemed harmless, in every parent watching a child walk beyond the edge of protection. The 7 Hathors did not need to chase anyone. They only had to wait. Number 4, Anubis in Jackal form, after the 7 Hathors waited quietly in the future. The Egyptians turned toward a danger that waited much closer, just beyond the edge of the village, on the dry ground where the living placed their dead. The jackal, or more precisely the animal Egyptians recognized as a jackal, though some modern zoologists identify the wild canids of Egypt as African golden wolves rather than true jackals. Ancient people were not working from modern genetic classifications. They knew a lean, sharp-eared, dog-like scavenger that moved through the desert after dark, an animal that appeared where human beings were most vulnerable, near graves. Egyptian cemeteries were usually placed on the western edge of settlements, beyond the cultivated fields where the green Nile valley gave way to dry desert ground. This was practical. Good farmland was too valuable to fill with the dead. The desert was also dry, stable, and elevated above the floodwaters. A body buried in sand could remain remarkably well preserved. But the desert was not empty. At night it belonged to animals that could smell meat beneath loose soil. Jackals and other scavengers moved through the margins of human life, searching for whatever the world had left unprotected. A shallow grave, a damaged tomb, a body abandoned during a crisis, the remains of an animal sacrifice. These were opportunities, and for an Egyptian family this was not just unpleasant. It was horrifying. The survival of the body mattered deeply in Egyptian religious thought. Death was not imagined as a clean disappearance, with the person simply floating away from physical existence. The dead still needed identity. They needed a name. They needed offerings. They needed a body that could be recognized, cared for, and restored through ritual. So imagine the fear behind every cemetery wall and every sealed tomb door. Not only grave robbers, though they were a constant threat. Not only flood water, decay, or the collapse of a burial chamber, but an animal quietly digging in the sand, pulling apart what a family had tried desperately to preserve. The jackal became a creature of the boundary. It lived where cultivation ended and wilderness began. It moved between the human settlement and the desert necropolis. By day it could be glimpsed at a distance, crossing empty ground. By night it became harder to see, reduced to sounds in the darkness. Tracks around a grave, a shape moving between tombs. That kind of animal does not need to attack people to become frightening. It only needs to appear in the place where people bury those they love. And this is where the Egyptian response becomes brilliant. Instead of treating the graveyard scavenger as only a symbol of desecration, they gave it a divine face. Anubis was shown as a black canid, sometimes entirely animal, sometimes a man with the head of a jackal. The colour matters. Actual jackals were not black. They were sandy, greyish, brown, made to disappear against desert ground. But Anubis was usually black because black could suggest the rich Nile silt, fertility, renewal, and the dark colour associated with preserved bodies and resins used in burial practices. In other words, the god did not simply copy the animal. He transformed it. The scavenger that might threaten a grave became the being with authority over graves. The watcher in the desert became the guardian of the desert dead. It was an ancient religious strategy that appears again and again across human cultures. If something has power over you, Perhaps you do not defeat it by pretending it does not exist. Perhaps you honor it, name it, give it a place in the cosmic order, and ask it to stand on your side. That may be why images of Anubis could appear near tombs with such confidence. The animal shape did not deny the fear, it acknowledged it completely. Yes, wild canids walked among the graves. Yes, they could uncover what should remain hidden. Yes, death brought the body into a landscape where human control weakened. But the Egyptians refused to leave that landscape unguarded. And if you enjoy these strange places where history, belief, and unanswered questions meet, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. For now, stay with that black shape at the edge of the cemetery, because Anubis was not only the answer to a practical fear about scavengers in the sand. Over time, he became something far more essential, the divine figure who could approach the dead when almost no one else could. He became the divine figure who could approach the dead when almost no one else could. In Egyptian myth, Anubis was the embalmer. This was not a minor job. Embalming was the first great act of care after death. It was the work of stopping chaos from taking the body apart, the work of making a person ready for whatever came next. The process could take weeks. The body was washed. Its internal organs were carefully removed and protected. It was dried with natron, a naturally occurring salt, then wrapped in linen layer after layer. Resins, oils, amulets, spoken formulas and knots were added along the way. Each step had practical value, but it also had religious meaning. This was preservation, certainly, but it was also transformation. A dead body was being made into an enduring body, and Egyptian tradition gave Anubis a central place in that transformation. One famous myth tells how Osiris, the murdered king of the dead, was restored after his body had been attacked and scattered by his brother Set. Isis and Nephthys mourned him. Other gods assisted, but Anubis was said to have prepared the body of Osiris, creating the first mummy, that made him more than a watcher at the edge of a graveyard. He was the one who understood the dangerous middle stage, the period when a person was no longer alive, but had not yet reached the safe and ordered existence hoped for in the next world. Anubis knew how to cross that boundary without being lost in it. For an Egyptian family, that must have been comforting. The people performing the burial could see the body being wrapped. They could hear the priests speak, but in the religious imagination, Anubis was there too, quietly doing the work that human hands could only imitate. That may explain one detail found in Egyptian funerary art and ritual. Priests sometimes wore masks shaped like the head of Anubis while performing ceremonies for the dead. We should be careful here. Not every image tells us exactly what happened in every funeral. Ancient art can be symbolic, idealized, even theatrical, but the message is still clear enough. When the priest put on the black canine face, he was not pretending to be a random animal. He was taking on the role of the god who knew the proper path through death. Anubis also appears in the ceremony called the opening of the mouth. This ritual was performed for the deceased, and sometimes for statues of the deceased, using specialized tools touched to the mouth and face. The goal was to restore essential capacities, to let the dead breathe again, speak again, receive offerings again, perhaps even see and hear again. It sounds strange to modern ears, but think about what it meant. Death had closed every door, no breath, no voice, no taste of bread or beer placed on the offering table. No answer when loved ones spoke the dead person's name. The ritual imagined those doors opening once more, and Anubis stood nearby, not as death itself, but as the expert who made renewal possible. This role grew over a very long time. Before Osiris became the great ruler of the underworld, Anubis seems to have held an even more prominent position among the gods of the dead. Later, he did not disappear when Osiris rose in importance. He became something like the indispensable official of the afterlife. Osiris might reign over the blessed dead, but Anubis handled the passage. He prepared the body, he protected the burial, he received the newcomer. And then came the judgment. In scenes familiar from the Book of the Dead, the deceased stands before a set of divine powers and makes a declaration about the life they lived. The heart, understood as the centre of memory, thought and character, is weighed against the feather of Mat, the principle of truth, balance and right order. Anubis is often the one at the scale. Picture him there. Not wild, not snarling, not tearing at the vulnerable body in the sand. He is calm, precise, almost priest-like. One hand may adjust the balance. He ensures that the measure is fair. Thoth records the result. Other beings wait nearby, and the deceased faces the terrifying possibility that a life cannot be hidden simply because it has ended. This was not necessarily a promise that every Egyptian expected perfect justice from the world around them. They knew life could be unfair. Crops failed. Officials stole. Children died. Tomb robbers broke into the homes of the dead. But the weighing scene imagined a deeper order beyond all that. A place where the heart itself could speak. Anubis mattered because he was trusted at the point where fear and fairness met. He was the guide who brought the dead to the threshold, the embalmer who made the body ready, the guardian who helped ensure the burial had not been abandoned to disorder, and the silent official who oversaw the moment when a person's hidden life was placed in the balance. That is an astonishing transformation for a desert canid. The animal associated with the lonely edges of the necropolis became the being who guaranteed that nobody had to make the final journey entirely alone. And yet Anubis did not guide the dead through every road of the next world by himself. The Egyptians also imagined another canine power, one whose name meant something like opener of the ways. A god who did not wait at the tomb, a god who went ahead into the unknown. Number 5. Wepwawet, the wolf of the roads. Or perhaps not a wolf. That is the first small mystery surrounding him. Modern books often call Wepwawet a wolf god. The name has a good sound to it, wolf of the roads. It makes him seem ancient, solitary, dangerous enough to walk where ordinary people would hesitate. But the animal shown in Egyptian art is not always easy to identify with the confidence we like to have. Sometimes he looks jackal-like, sometimes wolf-like, sometimes simply like a long-legged wild canid, alert and still with pointed ears, a narrow muzzle, and a tail hanging low behind him. To the Egyptians, that uncertainty may not have mattered as much as it matters to us. They were not making a field guide for modern zoologists. They were creating sacred images, and sacred images do not always care about the precise differences between one species and another. A god could take the recognizable form of a desert canine without being limited to the behavior of any one animal. Still, the question is worth asking. What animal did they have in mind? For a long time, European writers used the word jackal for almost every Egyptian god with a canine head. Anubis became the jackal god. Wepwawet became the wolf god. Neat categories. Easy labels. Ancient Egypt, as usual, is less neat. The Nile Valley and surrounding deserts were home to several wild canids across the thousands of years of Egyptian history. There were jackals, there were foxes. There may have been wolves or wolf-like populations in regions that have changed enormously since the age of the pharaohs. Modern classifications have changed too. The animal once commonly called the Egyptian jackal is now often discussed as the African wolf, a reminder that even modern science has had trouble deciding where the boundaries belong. So when we look at Wepwawet, we should resist the urge to say, "This is definitely a wolf, case closed." Maybe he was based on an animal Egyptians saw moving at the edge of cultivated land. Maybe he combined traits from several animals. Maybe the point was never the species at all. Maybe the point was the feeling. A canine is an animal of the border. It can live near people without belonging to them. It can follow a scent beyond the last house, beyond the fields, beyond the place where lamps shine from doorways. It knows the dry ground beyond the river's reach. It moves through ruined places, burial grounds, desert tracks, and empty country with an ease that humans can only envy. That made it a powerful shape for a god. Wepwawet is usually shown not as a human with a canine head, like Anubis, but as the entire animal, a slim, dark creature standing on 4 legs. In many images, he appears raised high on a standard, a pole bearing his figure above a group of people. This is one of the oldest and strangest forms of Egyptian divine imagery. Before temples became the massive stone buildings we know from photographs, gods could be represented by standards carried in processions. The sacred power was not necessarily hidden in a sealed sanctuary. It could be lifted above the crowd, visible from far away, moving with the people, and Wepwawet was one of those gods. His image appears very early in Egyptian history, including material connected with Abydos, one of the most important sacred places in the ancient Nile Valley. That matters because Abydos was not some forgotten village at the edge of the map. Over time it became deeply connected with royal memory, pilgrimage, and the god Osiris. Wepwawet was already old there, old enough that later Egyptians may have looked at his standard and felt the weight of a world their own ancestors barely understood. A world before pyramids, before the famous names, before Egypt had fully settled into the patterns that now seem timeless to us. There is something almost eerie about that. A black canine figure on a pole. No detailed story required. No long explanation. Just the animal, standing above the human crowd, staring toward a place beyond it. If you enjoy these old mysteries, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with a link in the description. It is for those moments when one ancient question leads quietly into another, and the answer keeps moving just beyond reach. Wepwawet also had a major cult centre at Asyut, farther north along the Nile. The Greeks later associated the city with wolves and called it Lycopolis, the city of the wolf. But even that later label can make the picture seem simpler than it was. Egyptian religion lasted for millennia. Names shifted. Local traditions changed. Gods merged, separated, borrowed titles, and appeared beside one another in ways that do not fit a modern chart. Wepwawet could resemble Anubis. He could share the visual language of desert canids. Yet he was not merely Anubis under another name. Anubis feels close to the tomb, the wrapped body, the careful ritual gesture. Wepwawet feels farther out, not necessarily in a different world, just beyond the familiar edge of this one. And the Egyptians gave that prowling, watchful canine a name that tells us what he was believed to do. Wepwawet, the opener of ways. And that title was not a polite metaphor. A way could be blocked. It could be hidden beneath drifting sand. It could be held by an enemy army. It could end at a fortified gate, a steep ravine, a stretch of desert with no water, no landmarks, and no promise that anyone who entered would return. For an Egyptian army marching beyond the Nile Valley, the road was never just a line on a map. There were no maps in the modern sense. There were tracks, rumours, guides, wells known by experience, and the memory of those who had gone before. An expedition moving into the eastern desert toward Nubia, or into the Sinai Peninsula was entering country that could kill a careless traveller as efficiently as any enemy. So before the king's troops came the opener of ways. Wepwawet's standard appears in royal contexts from very early in Egyptian history. It was carried before the king, especially in scenes connected with conflict and royal ceremony. The meaning is hard to miss. The god went ahead. He cleared the path before the human ruler followed. Not necessarily by physically striking enemies himself, at least not in the simple way later stories might suggest. Egyptian divine power was often more complicated than that. A god made victory possible, he established order. He removed confusion. He ensured that the king moved in the correct direction, while his enemies moved toward defeat. And in Egyptian thought, the correct direction mattered enormously. The pharaoh was not simply a military commander hoping for good luck. He was supposed to preserve Ma'at, the fragile balance of order against chaos. When an army crossed a frontier, fought a rebellion, or claimed a dangerous route through foreign land, it could be presented as more than conquest. It was order extending into a place where order had weakened. Wepwawet opened that way. Imagine the strange confidence this may have offered. Ahead of the soldiers, above the dust and the spear points, rose the figure of the god on his standard. The king was not walking into unknown territory alone. Something older than the kingdom had already entered the wilderness ahead of him. But warfare was only one kind of journey. The other was death. And death, for the Egyptians, was the ultimate road with no visible return. A person could spend an entire lifetime preparing for it. Tombs were built, names were written, food offerings were arranged, spells were copied onto coffins, papyrus rolls and tomb walls. The dead were not imagined as simply disappearing into darkness. They had work to do, gates to pass, questions to answer, dangers to avoid. They had to find their way through a landscape that was sacred, complicated, and sometimes terrifying. This was the Duat, the realm of the dead. It was not exactly a heaven, not exactly an underworld, and not a single place with one fixed geography. Egyptian funerary texts describe waterways, fields, caverns, fiery regions, guarded doors, and divine courts. The details changed across centuries, but one fact remained steady. The dead needed guidance, they needed a path, and Wepwawet was called upon to open it. In funerary texts, he appears as a being who opens the roads of the sky and the paths of the Duat. He could make a way for the king. Later, his protective role could extend more broadly through religious belief, helping the dead move toward the blessed condition they hoped to achieve. This does not mean every Egyptian imagined Wepwawet in exactly the same way. Religion in ancient Egypt was never one tidy system shared identically by everyone from the delta to the southern border. Priests, kings, artisans and families all inherited traditions that shifted over time. But the recurring idea is clear enough. When the road ahead was closed, Wepwawet was the one who went first. That made him a fitting companion of Osiris, the great god associated with death, renewal, and the promise that life might continue beyond the grave. At Abydos, where Osiris became especially important, Wepwawet had an ancient place of his own. In processions, his standard could lead the way. The old opener moved before the god of the dead, as though even Osiris required a path prepared through the unseen country. There is something quietly moving in that. The Egyptians did not pretend that death was easy. They filled their burial texts with warnings because they believed the journey could be dangerous. A soul might lose its way, a gatekeeper might refuse entry, a hostile being might threaten the traveller. Even the heart of the dead person could become a problem, speaking against its owner at the moment of judgment. But they also believed that knowledge, ritual, and divine help could make a road where none seemed to exist. Wepwawet represented that hope, not the hope that there would be no darkness, not the hope that there would be no fear, but the hope that somebody had gone ahead into it, that somewhere beyond the last familiar boundary, a passage had been opened. And perhaps that is why this old god endured for so long. Kings needed roads through enemy land. The dead needed roads through eternity. Ordinary people knew that every life eventually reaches a place where the path vanishes into shadow. Then, in the Egyptian imagination, the opener of ways stepped forward, not to explain what waited at the end, only to make sure the road continued. Number 6, Sobek, the crocodile god. Wepwawet waited at the edge of the road, where the known world gave way to wilderness. Sobek waited somewhere else, under the water. The Nile was Egypt's great gift. It gave the country its fields, its drinking water, its fish, its roots for travel, its reeds for boats and baskets, its mud for bricks, and its annual flood that renewed the soil. Without the river there was no Egypt in the form we know it. There was only desert, broken by a narrow and improbable ribbon of life. But the Nile was never gentle simply because it was necessary. It could flood too high. It could flood too low. Its currents could overturn small boats. Its banks could collapse beneath the feet of animals and people. And in some reaches of the river, especially farther south, it held one of the most efficient predators on earth, the Nile crocodile. A full-grown Nile crocodile can reach lengths that sound almost exaggerated until you see the scale of the animal. Large males may exceed 5 meters. They are armoured in thick scales, driven by powerful muscles, equipped with jaws built to seize and hold. Their bite is among the strongest measured in any living animal. Not because a crocodile needs to chew its prey. It does not. It needs only one good grip. Then water does the rest. This is what made the crocodile so unnerving. A lion can be seen moving across the open ground. A hyena announces itself with noise. Even a snake, however dangerous, must often be close before it can strike. But a crocodile could be there for hours without making itself known. A pair of eyes, 2 raised nostrils, a shape that might be a floating branch, a dark stone, a patch of riverbank shadow. Then nothing, or almost nothing. The rest of the animal remained beneath the surface. And that surface could look perfectly calm. For people living along the Nile, water was not a distant wilderness. It was part of the daily schedule. People fetched water. Children played near the banks. Fishermen worked from small boats. Herds were brought down to drink. Laundry was washed at the edge. Reeds were cut. Nets were cast. Bodies of the dead might be carried across the river toward tombs on the western side. Every one of those ordinary acts brought people close to the place where crocodiles hid. You can understand why an Egyptian might look at a still stretch of river and see more than water. They might see a boundary. Above the surface was the familiar world. Fields, houses, boats, voices, sunlight. Below was a realm of mud, reeds, darkness, and things that moved without warning. The crocodile crossed between those worlds with terrifying ease. It could rest on a sandbank in the heat like a creature of solid land, then slide into the river so smoothly that it seemed to disappear. And once it disappeared, nobody could be entirely sure where it had gone. That is the kind of animal that becomes more than an animal, not necessarily because people misunderstood nature. Ancient Egyptians knew their environment closely. They watched animals with extraordinary patience. Their artists captured the shape of birds, cattle, cats, insects, and fish with a precision that still feels alive thousands of years later. They did not need a modern zoology textbook to know that crocodiles were dangerous. They knew because the river told them. A crocodile was hunger hidden in the shallows. It was force concealed beneath silence. It was an ancient body, armoured and low to the ground, emerging from the same river that made Egypt possible. Sobek gave a divine name to that power. He was usually shown as a man with the head of a crocodile, or sometimes as a full crocodile wearing royal and divine symbols. The image is striking, but perhaps it was not meant to be comfortable. A god did not always have to look reassuring. Egyptian gods could protect, nourish, punish, heal, destroy, and terrify. They were not pets. They were forces woven into the structure of the world. And Sobek belonged to the force of the river at its most unpredictable. There is an old mistake people sometimes make about Egyptian religion. They imagine every god as a separate character with one fixed personality, like a cast list in a modern story. But Egyptian belief was more flexible than that. A god could have different local roles. He could be connected with kingship in one context, fertility in another, military strength in another. His identity could overlap with other gods, change across centuries, and gather new meanings without losing the old ones. Sobek was never only a crocodile, but the crocodile was always there beneath him. That mattered because a crocodile did not merely threaten people. It also represented survival. It had endured in the Nile long before the first pharaohs. It laid eggs in the riverbanks, guarded its young, travelled through water that humans depended upon, but could never fully control. Its power was brutal, yes, but it was also ancient, successful, and undeniably real. And for an Egyptian standing near the river at dusk, that reality may have felt almost divine. The water darkening, the reeds moving slightly, a bird calling somewhere downstream. Then a ripple appearing where there should have been no ripple at all. That ripple might have been nothing, or it might have been Sobek. And in some parts of Egypt, this was not simply a poetic idea. Crocodiles were not only symbols painted on temple walls or imagined in stories. They were kept alive, fed, honoured, and treated as sacred beings. The most famous centre of Sobek's worship was the Fayum. The Fayum is an unusual region west of the Nile Valley, a broad, fertile depression connected to the river by canals and waterways. In antiquity, it contained Lake Moeris, known today as Lake Karun, along with marshes, fields, fish-rich water, and all the life that follows water in a dry country. It was exactly the sort of landscape where crocodiles could seem less like distant monsters and more like permanent neighbours. The Greeks later called one of its principal cities Crocodilopolis. The Egyptians called it Shedet, and at Shedet, Sobek was not an abstract god hidden somewhere beyond the stars. Ancient writers, especially the Greek geographer Strabo, describe a sacred crocodile living at the temple. It was reportedly kept in a pool, decorated with ornaments and fed by priests and visitors. Strabo claims that people offered it food, including bread, meat, and wine. You can picture the strangeness of that encounter. A visitor enters a temple complex expecting statues, incense, carved stone, priests in linen. Then there is movement in the water. A real crocodile, massive and silent, lies within the sacred enclosure. Not an image of divine power. The animal itself, breathing slowly beneath the Egyptian sun. To worship a sacred crocodile was not necessarily to believe that every crocodile was tame, kind, or safe. Quite the opposite. The point may have been that this creature carried a force no human could casually command. By caring for one animal within a temple, priests and worshippers established a relationship with the dangerous power beyond its walls. It was a negotiation. Feed the sacred creature. Honour Sobek. Ask for protection from the river, for healthy crops, for fertility, for strength, perhaps for the king's continued rule over a land that depended on water arriving in the right amount at the right time. Because Sobek was tied not only to danger, but to abundance. The Nile flood could be destructive, but it was also the mechanism that renewed Egyptian agriculture. Water brought silt. Silt brought grain. Grain sustained villages, cities, temples, armies, and palaces. The river's force was frightening because it was necessary. and Sobek, in many local traditions, could embody that productive force as well as its violence. This is one of the things that makes Egyptian religion feel so different from a simple list of good gods and evil gods. The same power could nourish or destroy. The same river that carried a boat could swallow it. The same creature that lurked near a watering place could also belong to the sacred order of creation. To modern minds, those ideas can seem contradictory. To the Egyptians, they may have seemed like two parts of one truth. And if you enjoy these ancient mysteries, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with a link in the description. Some questions have answers, others just get stranger the longer you sit with them. The Fayum was not the only place where Sobek mattered. His worship was widespread and lasted for an extraordinarily long time. Temples dedicated to him existed in several regions, and rulers could associate themselves with his strength. Some kings even took names connected with Sobek. During the Middle Kingdom, especially under the 12th dynasty, the god became deeply important in royal ideology. Pharaohs named Amenemhat and Senusret built in the Fayum and helped transform the region through major irrigation and settlement projects. It is tempting to see a connection. A royal government extending canals, managing water, reclaiming land, and making fertile fields where there had been marsh or desert. At the centre of that landscape stood the crocodile god, ruler of the waters and guardian of a region made prosperous by controlling them. Whether every ruler thought about Sobek in exactly those terms, we cannot know. But the symbolism was available, powerful, and impossible to miss. And the sacred crocodiles did not vanish when one temple animal died. Egyptian archaeologists have found large numbers of crocodile mummies, some carefully wrapped, some placed in special burials, some containing young crocodiles. At sites connected to Sobek, these remains suggest organized religious practice on a remarkable scale. People did not merely fear crocodiles from afar. They brought them into ritual life, raised them, preserved them after death, and offered them to the god. That does not mean ancient Egyptians were somehow comfortable around wild crocodiles. Sacred respect and practical fear can exist together perfectly well. In fact, they often do. A person could leave an offering at Sobek's temple, then still approach the riverbank with great caution. They could see a crocodile as holy, and still run from it. Maybe that is the deeper warning hidden in Sobek's cult. The Egyptians did not imagine sacred power as something safely removed from ordinary life. It could be in the canal beside a field, in the marsh beyond a village, in a temple pool, in the dark water under a boat. It could wear scales. It could wait without moving. And when it finally showed itself, people understood that the calm surface had never meant the world was calm beneath it. But water was only one place where Egypt's hidden dangers gathered. Beyond the green fields and the river's edge waited another force entirely. The dry horizon, the empty road, the storm rising out of the desert. Number 7. Set, Lord of the Desert Storm. If Sobek hid beneath the river's still surface, Set hid behind a creature nobody can identify with complete confidence. The Egyptians drew him as a man with the head of an animal. That sounds familiar enough. They gave gods falcon heads, ibis heads, jackal heads, crocodile heads. But Set's head is different. It does not look comfortably like anything still living along the Nile. It has a long curved muzzle, tall rectangular ears, a narrow canine-looking body in full animal form, and a tail that rises stiffly before ending in a strange fork or tuft. Egyptologists usually call it the Set animal, not because that solves the mystery. Because it doesn't. The ancient Egyptian name is often transliterated as Shah, though the exact sound of the word is uncertain. And for thousands of years, artists carved, painted, and moulded this animal in such recognizable ways that there can be little doubt they meant a particular sacred form. The tall ears, the downward curve of the snout, the impossible tail. These features appear again and again on temple walls, coffins, amulets, ceremonial objects, and royal monuments. It was not a random monster scribbled in the corner of mythology. It was a being people expected to recognize, just not necessarily in the way we do. At first glance, it resembles a donkey. That is one of the oldest suggestions. Donkeys were known in Egypt with their long ears and sturdy bodies. But the Set animal's muzzle is too peculiar, its tail too unnatural, and its body too stylized. A donkey does not quite fit. Others have proposed an aardvark. This is a more interesting possibility than it first appears. An aardvark has long ears, an elongated snout, a heavy tail, and unusual habits. It lives mostly at night, digs into the ground, and can seem almost unreal when encountered unexpectedly. To someone seeing one briefly in poor light, it might look like a creature assembled from leftovers: rabbit ears, pig-like snout, thick claws, heavy body. But aardvarks do not have forked tails either. Then there is the okapi theory. Okapis have long ears and an unusual, almost secretive appearance. They live in central African forests, far south of ancient Egypt's familiar Nile landscapes. If Egyptians knew of such animals through trade, stories, tribute, or rare captive specimens, the okapi could have seemed mysterious enough to become attached to a strange god. But the okapi's shape is still wrong. Its muzzle is not Set's muzzle. Its tail is not Set's tail. And there is limited evidence that ancient Egyptians encountered okapis often enough for this explanation to feel secure. Some scholars have suggested the animal might be a stylized wild dog, a fennec, a giraffe, a hyena, an anteater, or even a now extinct species remembered only in Egyptian art. Each proposal catches one small piece of the puzzle. None catches all of it. That is what makes Set's animals so unsettling. You can stand in front of an Egyptian image made 3,000 or 4,000 years ago and recognize a falcon immediately. You know what a crocodile is, you know what a hippopotamus is, but then Set appears with that long face and those alert ears, and the recognition breaks down. The image seems to be asking you a question. What exactly are you looking at? Maybe the answer is that Egyptians were not trying to draw an ordinary animal with scientific precision. Egyptian art had its own visual language. A god's image was designed to communicate identity, power, and sacred character. Details could be exaggerated because they mattered symbolically, not because an artist had measured them in the wild. A forked tail may have marked Set as different from every familiar creature. Those tall ears may have suggested a being that heard things humans could not hear. The curved muzzle may have made him deliberately hard to place, hovering between known categories. And that would make sense. Set was never an easy god. The Egyptians could honor him, fear him, invoke him, and blame him. He could appear in royal imagery and ritual texts, yet remain profoundly uncomfortable. He was part of the divine world, but he did not sit neatly within it. Even in the earliest periods of Egyptian history, Set's animal already had importance. It appears on ancient royal standards, those sacred emblems carried before the king. On the Nama palette, made around 3100 BC, a Set animal is shown among the standards connected with royal power. That is remarkably early. This strange creature was present near the beginning of pharaonic civilization, which raises an even stranger possibility. Maybe people did know what it was once. Maybe the original animal became rare, vanished from Egypt, or changed so much in artistic tradition that later viewers no longer recognized it. Over centuries, priests and artists may have copied an old sacred design, with great care, preserving its shape long after its living model had been forgotten. Or maybe there never was one model. Maybe Set's animal was always a deliberate composite, made from the parts of animals Egyptians already knew, but combined into something that could not be found in any field, marsh, stable or hunting ground, a creature built to remain unplaceable. And once you notice that, Set begins to feel less like a god who merely wore a strange animal's head. He begins to feel like the reason the animal was strange in the first place. Because Set belonged to what lay beyond the ordered world. For the Egyptians, order was not just a pleasant idea. It was survival. The Nile rose and fell in its proper season. Fields were measured, taxes were collected, temples performed their rituals. The king maintained Mart, the sacred balance that kept sky, river, land, gods, and people working together. And outside that balance waited everything else. The desert began only a short distance beyond the green ribbon of the Nile. One moment you could be standing among wheat fields, palm trees, irrigation channels, and villages. Walk far enough east or west, and the world changed into stone, heat, dry wind, empty wadies, and horizons that seemed to go on forever. That was Set's country. He was connected with the desert, with violent storms, with barrenness, confusion, and things arriving from beyond Egypt's borders. Not always evil things, not at first, but dangerous things. Unpredictable things, things that could not be measured as easily as a field beside the river. A desert storm is a good example. It does not politely announce itself. Wind begins to rise, sand lifts from the ground, the sky turns yellow, then brown. Familiar landmarks vanish. Paths disappear. A person can lose direction within minutes, with grit in the eyes, mouth, clothing, and lungs. For people whose lives depended on knowing where they were, that could feel like the work of a god who specialized in making certainty disappear. Set was also associated with thunder. Imagine hearing that sound roll over the desert or across the river valley, especially before people understood weather as we do. The sky itself seems angry. The dry landscape suddenly flashes with impossible light. Rain might come, but rain in the desert can be violent too, racing through dry channels and turning harmless-looking valleys into floods. Set did not represent gentle weather. He represented nature when it stopped cooperating. And yet the Egyptians did not simply erase him from their religion. That is the important part. Chaos was frightening, but it was real. A civilization that pretended storms, deserts, death, illness, foreign invasion, and human conflict did not exist, would not survive very long. So Set had a place. In some of the oldest traditions, he was a powerful god, connected with kingship and strength. Certain rulers even used his name. The second dynasty king Peribsen placed Set, rather than the usual falcon god Horus, above his royal name. Much later, pharaohs named Seti, meaning something like man of Set, ruled Egypt. Seti, I was one of the great kings of the 19th dynasty. That would be a strange name to choose for a purely hated demon. It suggests that Set's force could still be respected. A king needed order, certainly, but he also needed force against enemies. He needed power able to cross deserts, withstand storms, and face whatever approached from the unknown edges of the map. If you enjoy mysteries like this, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. And Set belongs there easily, because the more you look at him, the less he behaves like a simple villain. The Egyptians told one of their most important stories through his conflict with Horus. Horus, the falcon god, represented rightful kingship, the living ruler, and the ordered continuity of Egypt. Set became the rival, the disruptor, the one who murdered Osiris and fought Horus for control. In later periods especially, Set's reputation grew darker. He could embody rebellion, violence, sterility, and foreign enemies. As Egypt faced invasions and political uncertainty, the god of hostile frontiers became easier to blame for the threats pressing in from beyond the Nile Valley. But even then, there was a contradiction. Set could be necessary. Each night, according to Egyptian belief, the sun god Ra travelled through the underworld in a solar boat. There he faced Apep, the enormous serpent of darkness and destruction. Apep was not merely another god with a difficult personality. Apep was the enemy of creation itself, the force trying to stop the sun from rising, and one of Ra's fiercest defenders was Set. Armed with a spear, standing at the prow of the sun-boat, Set fought the serpent in the darkness. The god of storms and disorder became the guardian against a deeper, more absolute disorder. That is the strange logic of Set. Sometimes chaos can only be fought by someone who understands chaos. Sometimes the dangerous force at the edge of the world is also the force you need when the world is under attack. So where did Set hide? In the hot wind that erased tracks, in the thunder beyond the cultivated fields, in the uneasy stories told about distant lands and unfamiliar peoples. In every border where the known world gave way to something harder to name. The Egyptians warned that Set walked among them because disorder always does. Not as a beast waiting in one particular place, but as the sudden moment when the safe map ends. And beyond that map, the next beings were said to bring danger in a far more direct form. Number 8, the fiery messengers of Sekhmet. If Set was danger arriving from beyond the ordered world, Sekhmet was danger arriving from above. Her name is often translated as the Powerful One, and power in her case was not abstract. It was the white heat of noon, the kind of heat that makes stone burn beneath your hand, the kind that empties roads, dries canals at their edges, and turns the air above the desert into a trembling illusion. The Egyptians knew the sun as a giver of life. Without it, crops would not grow. The Nile Valley would not become green after the flood. The world itself would lose its rhythm, but the same sun could destroy. Too much heat could wither plants. Too little water could turn abundance into hunger. A body exposed to the burning day could become weak, confused, and helpless with frightening speed. So the solar god did not have only one face. There was warmth, light, renewal, and order. But there was also glare, drought, burning wind, and wrath. Sekhmet was that second face. She was usually imagined as a woman with the head of a lioness, crowned with the solar disk and cobra. Even in still images, she seems difficult to approach. The lioness was not chosen because it looked decorative. Lionesses were among the most formidable predators Egyptians knew. Quiet when they needed to be. Patient, fast, capable of bringing down animals much larger than themselves. Now combine that animal with the sun. That was Sekhmet. She could protect the king and destroy his enemies. She could stand beside Ra, the sun god, as his eye, an extension of divine sight and divine force. When Ra looked upon disorder, rebellion, or insult, Sekhmet could become the answer. Not a debate, not a warning, an answer. One of the most unsettling Egyptian stories appears in a text modern scholars call the Book of the Heavenly Cow. Its surviving versions are later than many of the beliefs behind it, but the story preserves something ancient and deeply Egyptian, the idea that humanity could provoke the sun god himself. Picture this. People have begun speaking against Ra. They have grown careless, perhaps arrogant, perhaps convinced that the old god is weak. Ra hears of it. He calls the other gods together and asks what should be done. Their answer is severe. Send your eye. Ra, sends the eye in the form of Sekhmet, and Sekhmet descends among humanity with the violence of a lioness released into a crowded enclosure. She hunts those who have rebelled, she tears through them. The story does not linger because it needs to. Egyptians already understood what a lioness did to prey. Sekhmet was not simply punishing people, she was divine solar power with no restraint left. That is what makes her different from a god of ordinary warfare. A human army can be negotiated with, it can become tired, lose supplies, turn back, or be defeated. But how do you defeat the sun at noon? How do you argue with heat? How do you hide from the horizon when the horizon itself seems to be blazing? The story becomes even stranger. Sekhmet enjoys the destruction. Her fury does not fade after the rebels have been punished. She continues, and Ra realizes that if she is not stopped, humanity may not survive at all. So the gods prepare a trick. They dye vast quantities of beer red, making it resemble blood, and spread it across the land. Sekhmet finds it at dawn. Believing she has discovered a great flood of blood, she drinks. She becomes drunk. Her rage softens. In some tellings, the fierce goddess becomes Hathor, a gentler divine power associated with love, music, beauty, and celebration. The details vary across Egyptian tradition, as they often do, but the central idea remains clear. The same divine force that nourishes life can also nearly erase it, and it must be calmed. This was not merely a dramatic myth about distant gods. It described the precariousness of ordinary life in Egypt. A good harvest and a ruined one could be separated by weather, water, timing, and forces no farmer could command. The sun that ripened grain could also scorch it. The ruler who defended Egypt could also lead men into war. Power was necessary. Power was dangerous. Sekhmet stood at that uncomfortable boundary. She was invoked as a protector, especially of kings and temples, because no one wanted a weak guardian standing between Egypt and its enemies. But a protector with the strength to destroy enemies also carried the terrifying possibility of turning that strength elsewhere. Think of a furnace. Controlled, it provides heat, light, and useful metal. Uncontrolled, it consumes the house built around it. Sekhmet was the furnace. The Egyptians did not deny its usefulness. They just knew better than to pretend it was harmless. And this is where the fiery goddess became even more frightening, because Sekhmet's wrath was not always imagined as arriving in person, with lioness jaws and a blazing crown. Sometimes it was believed to move through the world by means of unseen agents, messengers carrying the burning force of the solar eye into places where people least expected it. These messengers were not always given clear shapes. That was part of the problem. A lioness has a body. A storm has a sound. A crocodile leaves tracks in mud. But fever does not announce itself so clearly. It enters a house quietly. One person feels weak, then another. A child begins burning with heat. An older relative cannot stand. By the time anyone understands there is danger, the danger may already be moving through the neighborhood. For Egyptians, sudden illness could look like an invasion by invisible forces. Some texts speak of dangerous beings connected with Sekhmet, agents of her anger moving through the year, through particular days, through the hot and uncertain transitions of the seasons. Modern scholars are careful about exactly how these beings were imagined. Egyptian religious texts were never one single fixed system. They changed over thousands of years from temple to temple, town to town, family to family. But the pattern is there. Illness was not always treated as random. It could be understood as a disturbance in the body caused by an outside power. A messenger had entered. Something hostile had found an opening. And if the messenger came from Sekhmet, then the response had to be serious. You did not simply wait for it to pass. You acted. Egyptian medicine, as we would call it, mixed practical treatment with sacred protection. Healers used bandages, salves, oils, honey, beer, herbs, and mineral preparations. Some remedies probably helped. Honey can limit bacterial growth. Linen bandages can protect wounds. Certain plants have real medicinal properties. Others may have done very little except give frightened people the comfort of action. But physical treatment was only part of the plan. Words mattered too. A healer might recite spells over a remedy before applying it. The words could identify the illness, name the dangerous force behind it, and command it to leave. Naming was powerful in Egyptian thought. If you knew what something was called, perhaps you could address it. Perhaps you could threaten it. Perhaps you could send it back to the place it came from. Imagine being sick in ancient Egypt. You are lying in a mud brick house, too hot under a blanket, too cold without one. Your family has brought water. Someone has prepared a remedy. And beside you a healer speaks ancient words meant to put a boundary around your body. The disease is not allowed to stay. The messenger is told it has no right to remain. It is a strange mixture of care, fear, medicine, and command. And it makes sense. When people face a threat they cannot see, they look for ways to make it visible enough to resist. Temples also played a role. Sekhmet was dangerous, but she was not only dangerous. The same goddess whose force could bring sickness could also be asked to drive sickness away. This sounds contradictory until you think about how people deal with fire. The fire that burns can also sterilize. The weapon that threatens can defend. The power that causes terror may be the only power strong enough to defeat terror. Priests made offerings, recited hymns, and performed rites intended to soothe divine anger and restore balance. Food, drink, incense, flowers, and carefully spoken prayers were not casual gifts. They were acts of maintenance. The world was always in danger of slipping toward disorder. Ritual was one way of holding it together. During certain festivals, the story of Sekhmet's rage being calmed with red beer may have been remembered through music, drinking, celebration, and offerings. Not everyone in Egypt experienced these ceremonies in the same way, and the evidence does not let us reconstruct every detail. Still, the larger purpose is clear enough. Danger had to be transformed. Rage had to become protection. The deadly heat had to be turned aside before it reached the village, the palace, the nursery, the body. And for people trying to understand the mysteries ancient cultures left behind, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. It explores the kind of questions that linger when old texts, strange rituals, and human fear meet across thousands of years. One remarkable example of Sekhmet's importance comes from the reign of Amenhotep III, around the 14th century BCE. Hundreds of statues of the lioness goddess were commissioned for his temples, especially at Thebes. They show her seated or standing, composed and alert, holding the symbols of divine life and power. Why so many? We cannot read the king's private thoughts. But many scholars think the statues were connected with rituals of healing, protection, and the management of Sekhmet's dangerous force. Egypt may have been dealing with disease outbreaks during his reign. Or perhaps the king wanted divine protection against every threat a long reign could bring. Probably both possibilities mattered. The statues were not merely decoration. Each one was a presence, a place where prayers could be directed. A reminder that Sekhmet's power was near and that it needed constant respect. That is the unsettling logic behind her fiery messengers. They hid better than lions, storms, or crocodiles because they could hide inside ordinary misfortune, in a cough, in a fever, in the sudden weakness of a healthy person. The Egyptians answered that fear with remedies, rituals, offerings, and words spoken into the dark. They could not make disease fully understandable, No ancient society could. But they refused to meet it empty-handed. Number 9, Medjed, the hidden Smiter. After invisible illness, we come to something even stranger. Not a creature with claws, not a god with the head of an animal, not a monster rising from the Nile or stalking the desert at night. Medjed appears as a covered shape. In one of the most famous surviving copies of the Book of the Dead, the Papyrus of Ani, he is shown as a small pale figure beneath a kind of cloth or shroud. His body is completely hidden. Only 2 human eyes peer out from the upper part of the covering. Below it, 2 feet protrude, as though this concealed being is standing there, quietly waiting. That is all. Eyes, feet, and the blank, closed space between them. It is one of the most peculiar images in ancient Egyptian art. The Egyptians gave careful forms to so many divine beings. They could portray a falcon god with perfect precision, a lioness goddess in royal dress, a crocodile deity with a powerful human body, a jackal standing alert beside a tomb. But Medjed is almost not portrayed at all. He is a presence under a veil. Imagine seeing him in the dim light of an Egyptian tomb chapel or on a roll of papyrus unwrapped for ritual use. At first your eyes might pass over him. He does not fill the page. He is not enormous. There is no great throne, no blazing crown, no weapon raised in his hand. Then you notice the eyes. They are looking out from somewhere you cannot enter, and suddenly the little figure becomes difficult to forget. The image appears in a section of the Book of the Dead associated with spell 17, one of the long and complicated compositions that attempted to explain the structure of the world, the identities of gods, and the dangers faced after death. The Book of the Dead was not one single book in the modern sense. It was a collection of spells, prayers, declarations, and sacred knowledge. Different people owned different versions. Some were short, some were richly illustrated, some included passages that others left out. The Papyrus of Ani, made around 1250 BCE for a high-ranking official in Thebes, is among the most elaborate examples to survive. Its paintings are beautiful, detailed, and often deeply strange. They show the dead man navigating a universe where every gatekeeper, every god, every spoken phrase might matter. Medjed belongs to that universe, but he is not explained with the clarity we might want. Ancient Egyptian religion often leaves us with this problem. A god or being can be named in one text, depicted in another, and barely mentioned anywhere else. Modern readers expect a neat entry in a dictionary. Name, family powers, symbol, story. The Egyptians did not always organize sacred knowledge that way. Their religious world had grown over centuries upon centuries. Local traditions mixed with royal theology. Old gods acquired new identities. A being might be familiar to priests who had studied the rituals, yet remain almost invisible in the surviving evidence available to us now. Medjed is a perfect example. We can see him, we can read his name, but we cannot fully recover what every Egyptian who encountered that image would have felt. Maybe the concealment itself was the point. Think about what a veil does. It does not simply hide a thing. It tells you that there is something behind the hiding place. It turns absence into expectation. A closed door can be ignored. But a door that is slightly open with someone watching through the gap creates a different kind of fear. Medjed is like that. He does not reveal a face. He gives no clue about whether he is human, animal, divine, or something else entirely. The hidden body could contain anything. The visible eyes suggest awareness. The visible feet suggest movement. He can see you. He can come toward you, but you cannot know what he is. That makes him different from the familiar protective figures Egyptians kept close to them. Bears could be ugly, comic, and frightening, but at least you could look directly at him. Taweret had the heavy body of a hippopotamus, the limbs of a lion, the tail of a crocodile. Her strange form was clear. Even Apep, the great serpent of darkness, had a recognizable shape. Medjed offers no such comfort. He is hidden even while he stands in front of you. And perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, the image has found a strange new life. In modern Japan, Medjed became unexpectedly popular as a kind of mysterious cartoon-like figure. People saw the little white shrouded being, the staring eyes, the tiny feet, and found him both funny and unsettling. It is an odd journey for an ancient Egyptian religious figure, from a funerary papyrus in Thebes to internet jokes, toys, and fan art. But the modern humour should not make us miss what is genuinely eerie about the original. The ancient image was placed among words meant to help a dead person understand the unseen world. It belonged to a landscape where hidden powers were real dangers, where knowledge was protection, and where the dead needed to recognize beings before those beings could recognize them. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why would a figure in that world need to remain concealed? Maybe the answer is in his name. Medjed is usually translated as the Smiter, or the one who strikes. It is not a gentle name. It does not suggest a guide, a healer, a messenger, or a guardian waiting at the door with a friendly warning. It suggests impact, a blow that lands, and perhaps more unsettlingly, a blow that arrives before you understand where it came from. In ancient Egyptian thought, names were never just labels. To know a name was to know something essential about its owner. Names could be used in prayer, in protection, in curses, and in ritual. A dead person travelling through the next world needed names constantly. The names of gates, the names of gatekeepers, the names of dangerous regions, the names of gods whose favour might determine whether the journey continued. Knowledge was not abstract. Knowledge was equipment. If you knew the right words, you were less helpless. That is why a name like Medjed mattered. The dead person was not merely being told that an obscure being existed somewhere in the divine landscape. They were being warned about his nature. This is the Smiter. This is a power associated with striking down, with force delivered against an enemy. And in the Book of the Dead, enemies were everywhere. They could be hostile spirits. They could be forces of disorder. They could be the enemies of Osiris, the murdered god whose death and restoration became the great pattern for every Egyptian hoping to live again. Or they could be something even closer: fear, confusion, the loss of identity, the terrible possibility that the dead person might fail to speak, fail to remember, fail to become effective in the world beyond death. The afterlife was not imagined as a soft cloud where everyone automatically found peace. It was a vast, complicated territory, full of tests and officials and divine powers. Some were helpers, some were judges, some defended the cosmic order by destroying whatever threatened it. Medjed may have belonged to that last category. His threatening name does not necessarily mean that he was there to attack every dead person who saw him. Egyptian gods could be dangerous and protective at the same time. Sekhmet brought plague, but could also repel it. Sobek could be a terrifying crocodile force, but also a royal protector. A power that smites chaos might be exactly the power you wanted on your side. But there was a condition: you had to know who you were dealing with. You had to be able to say the name. And perhaps that is the real pressure hidden inside Medjed's tiny, strange presence. He is concealed, but his identity is not entirely inaccessible. The papyrus gives the dead a way to address what they cannot fully see. It is like being handed one word in the middle of a dark room, not enough to reveal everything, but maybe enough to keep the darkness from closing in. There is something deeply human in that idea. We still name things when we are frightened by them: storms, diseases, fears, mysteries in the sky. Once something has a name, it feels slightly less able to move unnoticed through our thoughts. Though not harmless, never harmless, and Medjed's name remains threatening because it tells us that concealment was not weakness. The hidden being was hidden because the force behind the veil did not need to explain itself. He could act without revealing a face. He could strike without showing a weapon. His eyes were enough to suggest intention. His feet were enough to suggest that he could approach. Everything else remained unknown. If you enjoy these old mysteries, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with a link in the description. It explores the strange places where ancient evidence survives, but certainty does not. Medjed belongs in exactly that space. We can translate his name. We can recognize the threat within it. We can place him among the dangerous and protective powers surrounding the Egyptian dead. But we cannot reconstruct a full myth of Medjed. No great surviving temple story tells us where he came from, who worshipped him, or what every priest believed about him. And perhaps that absence fits him. The Smiter is not a god who steps into the light and introduces himself. He remains partly covered by time, partly covered by the old sacred text, staring out through two openings in a veil. A warning with no visible hand behind it. But the Egyptians had an even more direct warning waiting beyond the hidden Smiter. Not a being concealed beneath cloth, a creature placed openly beside the scales of judgment, ready for the one soul that had failed completely. And unlike Medjed, she had very sharp teeth. Number 10. Ammit, the Devourer of the Dead. And yes, unlike Medjed, she had very sharp teeth. Ammit was not hidden beneath a cloth. She was not a vague presence with eyes peering from a blank white shape. The Egyptians gave her a body assembled from some of the most dangerous animals in their world. The head of a crocodile, the front half of a lion, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. It sounds almost exaggerated at first, like someone took 3 nightmares from the banks of the Nile and forced them into one creature. But that was exactly the point. Ammit was not meant to look natural. She was meant to look like danger made visible. Her name is often translated as the Devourer, though it can appear in slightly different forms in modern translations. Sometimes she is called Ammit, sometimes Ammit, sometimes the Devourer of the Dead. The name changes a little because ancient Egyptian words have to pass through several layers before they reach us. Hieroglyphic spelling, scholarly reconstruction, and modern pronunciation. But the meaning is clear enough. She devoured, and in a culture where survival after death depended on preserving the self, being devoured was not simply an unpleasant ending. It was the end of endings. It meant no peaceful continuation, no transformed spirit moving freely, no return to the offerings and prayers of the living. Just disappearance. To understand why Ammit looked the way she did, picture Egypt as the Egyptians knew it. Not the Egypt of museum cases and quiet temple ruins. A living land organized around the Nile, with fertile fields pressed tightly between vast deserts. The river was life. It brought water, fish, transport, and rich black soil. But it was never harmless. Crocodiles lived in those waters. A crocodile does not need to chase you across a field. It waits. It barely moves. Its eyes and nostrils can remain above the surface, while the rest of its body disappears into the brown water. Then something comes close enough. An animal drinks. A person wades in, a boat tips, and the stillness ends. That is the horror of the crocodile, not just its teeth, but its patience. A crocodile head gave Ammit a mouth built for sudden finality. Then came the lion. Lions were known in ancient Egypt, especially in earlier periods and in the desert margins beyond settled land. They were associated with royal power, heat, violence, and the dangerous edge between civilization and the wilderness. A lion was not a creature that hid in river mud. It was visible strength. Muscle, claws, speed, and a predator's confidence. Egyptian rulers sometimes compared themselves to lions because lions represented dominance. Gods could take leonine forms because the lion was a force that could defend order by destroying its enemies. But Ammit was not a royal lioness offering protection to the innocent. Her lion body told you that she could overpower what stood before her. And then there was the hippopotamus. To modern eyes, hippopotamuses can seem almost comic. Huge round bodies, small ears, heavy heads. They look like animals designed by someone who had stopped taking nature seriously. But ancient Egyptians had no such illusion. A hippopotamus could crush a small boat, destroy crops, gore a person with its enormous tusks, and kill with a violence that made even experienced hunters careful. Adult males were immensely territorial. Females protecting calves could be equally dangerous. They lived at the very source of Egypt's prosperity in the river and marshland, but they could turn that prosperity into ruin overnight. A hippopotamus was abundance with teeth, so Ammit carried the crocodile's ambush, the lion's predatory force, and the hippopotamus's unstoppable bulk. Water, desert, marsh. 3 environments, 3 kinds of terror. 1 body. And there is something precise about this combination. Egyptians did not invent monsters merely to be strange. Composite beings could express several powers at once. A god or demon could be more than one thing, because the world itself was more than one thing. Order and danger could exist side by side. A river could feed a village and take someone beneath its surface. A lion could represent royal protection and the violence needed to preserve it. Ammit gathered the destructive side of these animals into herself. She was not usually treated as a major deity with great temples, festivals, and a large following of worshippers. She was closer to an appointed terror, a necessary threat inside a universe that believed actions had consequences. She did not roam Egypt looking for victims. She waited in a particular place, for a particular moment, when the fate of the dead person became impossible to avoid. And that is what makes her more unsettling than a beast in the wilderness. A crocodile can be avoided, a lion can be driven away. A hippopotamus can be given a wide distance, but Ammit waited where every dead person hoped to go, beside the final test. The final test was the weighing of the heart. Not the brain, not the lungs, not the hands that had done the work of a lifetime. The heart, to the ancient Egyptians, the heart was far more than a pump inside the chest. It was the seat of memory, judgment, intention, character. It carried the record of the person you had been, every kindness, every betrayal, every theft, every act of cruelty, every promise broken when nobody else was watching. You could hide things from neighbours. You could hide things from a judge while alive. But the heart knew. And after death, according to the texts and images that survive, the heart could speak. Picture the Hall of Two Truths, sometimes called the Hall of Maat. This was not a courtroom in the modern sense, with lawyers arguing over evidence and witnesses forgetting what they saw. This was more terrifying than that. The dead person stood before divine powers, facing a truth that could not be negotiated away. At the centre stood a balance scale. On one side, the heart of the deceased. On the other, the feather of Maat. Maat was one of the most important ideas in Egyptian religion. The word can refer to a goddess, but also to truth, justice, balance, right order, the proper arrangement of the universe. The annual flooding of the Nile, the movement of the sun, the authority of the king, honesty between people, fairness in judgment, all of it could be understood through Maat. A feather seems like a delicate thing to place against a human heart, but that was the point. The test was not whether you had been perfect. No Egyptian farmer, official, priest, or king could have lived without making mistakes. The question was whether your heart had become burdened by disorder, whether you had lived in a way that damaged the balance holding the world together. In some versions of the judgment, Anubis handled the scales. The jackal-headed god, guardian of the dead, carefully adjusted the beam. He was not there to save anyone. He was there to make sure the weighing was exact. Nearby stood Thoth, often shown with the head of an ibis. Thoth was the divine scribe, master of writing, measurement, and knowledge. He recorded the result. Again, there was no bribing him, no confusing him, no hoping that a clerk had made an error in the paperwork. This was cosmic accounting, and the dead person did not merely stand silent. In the Book of the Dead, especially in the famous spell often called the negative confession, the deceased makes a long series of declarations before a group of divine judges. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not cheated the measures of grain. I have not caused suffering. The exact wording varies between texts because Egyptian religion was never one single unchanging system. It developed across thousands of years, across cities, temples, and social classes. But the message is remarkably direct. How you treated other people mattered. How you treated the vulnerable mattered. Even cheating with weights and measures mattered. The universe was watching the small things. And if you enjoy these strange places where history, religion, and mystery overlap, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with a link in the description. Because the more you look into ancient beliefs, the more you realize people in the past were asking many of the same questions we still ask now. What follows us? What judges us? And what parts of us survive when everything else is gone? For the Egyptians, the answer depended on that scale. If the heart balanced with the feather, the deceased could continue. They could enter the blessed afterlife, travel with the sun god, receive offerings, reunite with loved ones, and become an effective spirit among the dead. Death was not necessarily an ending. It was a dangerous crossing, but one that could lead into another kind of life. But if the heart failed the test, Ammit was waiting. Not as the judge. That distinction matters. Ammit did not decide guilt. She did not listen to excuses. She did not weigh the evidence. She was the consequence after judgment had already been made. If the heart was too heavy, too full of falsehood and violence and disorder, it was handed over to her, and she consumed it. For ancient Egyptians, this may have been worse than physical death. The body could die, but through burial, ritual, names, offerings, and memory, a person could still endure. To lose the heart in the judgment hall was to lose the possibility of that continuation. Some modern descriptions call it annihilation or a second death. We should be careful because Egyptian ideas about the afterlife were complex and changed over time. But the fear is unmistakable. You did not simply go somewhere unpleasant. You were cut off from becoming whole again. That is why Ammit had no need to wander the earth. She did not need temples full of worshippers. She did not need to chase people through the dark. She waited beside the scales, where every secret eventually became weight. And once the heart spoke, there was nowhere left to hide. Number 11. Apep, the serpent in the dark. If Ammit waited where the dead could no longer hide from the truth, Apep was something different entirely. Apep hid where no human eye could follow, beyond the western horizon, beneath the earth, in the vast black distance that opened every evening when the sun went down. The Egyptians called him Apep, though Greek writers later knew him as Apophis. He was not a god in the ordinary sense. He had no great city devoted to his worship, no cheerful festivals, no family of divine companions bringing him offerings. Apep was the enemy of order itself, a serpent of darkness, chaos, violence, and unmaking. And every night, according to Egyptian belief, he tried to destroy the sun. This was not a small threat. The sun was Ra. Its daily journey across the sky was not merely a natural event to the Egyptians. It was the visible proof that the universe was still functioning. Each morning light returned. Fields could be worked. Boats moved on the Nile. Children woke up. The king ruled. The dead received their offerings. Ma'at, the great balance of truth and order, remained intact. But every evening Ra disappeared. For us, sunset is ordinary. We understand the earth is turning. The sun is not actually sinking beneath the land. But imagine living in a world where darkness arrives with no guarantee that it will ever leave. Imagine watching the great disk of the sun touch the western edge of the world and vanish into a place no living person could reach. Where did it go? The Egyptians had an answer. Ra entered the Duat, the hidden realm of night and death. There he travelled in a solar boat through a dangerous underworld, passing through 12 regions, one for each hour of the night. He encountered gates, strange beings, blessed dead, divine allies, lakes of fire, caverns and powers older than human memory. And somewhere in those depths Apep was waiting. Sometimes he was imagined as an immense serpent, long enough to fill the underworld. Some texts give him impossible dimensions, a body stretching for hundreds of cubits, a mouth wide enough to swallow the solar boat, coils that could block the path of Ra and stop the forward movement of time itself. This is where Apep hid best, not in a temple chamber, not in a tomb, not in the desert where a traveller might glimpse him between rocks. He existed beyond the visible sky, in the unseen place below the world. You could not look up and find him. You could not look across the Nile and see him coming. You only knew he was there because night kept arriving, and because dawn had to fight its way back. In Egyptian religious texts, Ra did not simply drift peacefully through the darkness. His journey was work. It was conflict. The solar boat moved through waters that were not always calm, and its crew had to defend it. Deities such as Seth, often feared in his own right as a lord of storms and deserts, could appear as one of Ra's defenders, standing at the prow with a spear. Other divine beings bound, cut, restrained, or repelled the serpent. The details changed from text to text. That is important. Egyptian religion developed over more than 3,000 years, and different temples told the cosmic story in different ways. But the central idea remained remarkably stable. Apep attacked. Ra resisted. Morning proved that the defenders had won again. Think about the emotional weight of that belief. Every sunrise was not just beautiful. It was evidence. The sun had survived another assault. The world had not slipped back into the darkness before creation. The enemy had failed for one more day. Some Egyptian texts describe Apep using terrifying methods. He might coil around the solar bark and trap it. He might swallow water, trying to leave the boat stranded. He might unleash a roar so powerful that the crew lost their senses. He could bring darkness, storms, confusion, and the kind of sudden disorder that made people wonder whether the normal rules of life had stopped working. Apep did not need to kill people one by one. He threatened the structure that made life possible at all. That is why he was more frightening than a dangerous animal, even though he had the form of one. A crocodile could take you at the riverbank. A scorpion could sting you in your bed. Apep could take the sun. He could end the pattern. And in a civilization built around cycles, that was the deepest possible horror. The Nile rose and fell. Seeds went into dark soil and came back as grain. The dead passed into another realm and, if all went well, continued there. The king renewed order. The sun crossed the sky, vanished, and returned. Apep represented the possibility that one morning it would not return. Perhaps that is why eclipses could feel especially ominous. When darkness seemed to bite into the sun during the day, it was easy to imagine the serpent had somehow reached farther than usual. Even a storm that blotted out the daylight, or an unusually red sunrise over the desert, could be folded into a universe where the battle was always happening just beyond sight. But the Egyptians did not believe people were helpless spectators. If Apep attacked the sun every night, then human beings had a role in the defense of creation, and that role led to some of the strangest, most deliberate acts ever performed against an enemy no one expected to see. They fought him with words, not casual words, not prayers in the modern sense, where a person asks a distant power for help and hopes to be heard. These were spoken weapons, carefully preserved formulas, copied by temple scribes, recited by priests, and sometimes written down for the dead to use in the next world. The Egyptians believed that the right name, spoken in the right way, could affect reality. If creation itself had been ordered through divine speech, then chaos could be driven back through speech as well. One collection of protective texts is now known as the Book of Overthrowing Apep. Surviving versions appear in temple inscriptions and ritual papyri, especially from later periods of Egyptian history. Its purpose was direct. It did not negotiate with the serpent. It did not ask Apep to become less dangerous. It told him to fail. The spells called for his defeat in every possible form. Apep was to be bound, cut apart, burned, crushed, his shadow destroyed, his name erased, his power prevented from reaching the solar boat. The language could be startlingly violent, because the thing being fought was not treated as an ordinary opponent. It was the force that wanted all boundaries to collapse. And there is a strange logic to this. Apep hid in darkness, so the rituals tried to expose him. Apep was imagined as vast and terrifying, so the rituals made him small enough to handle. Priests could create an image of the serpent from wax, clay, or papyrus. They might write his name on it. Then the image could be spat on, trampled, stabbed, cut with knives, tied with cords, and thrown into fire. Some rituals involve destroying written lists of enemies as well, linking the cosmic serpent with every threat to the order of Egypt. Foreign invaders, rebels, disease, bad harvests, disorder in the land. The goal was not simply revenge against enemies, it was restoration, the symbolic destruction of everything that threatened Maat. To a modern mind, stabbing a wax snake may sound like theatre. But that assumes the symbol and the thing it represented were completely separate. For the Egyptians they may not have been. An image could carry identity. A name could carry power to damage the image, to deny the name. To speak the command correctly was to reach into the hidden world where Apep existed. It was an attempt to make the invisible vulnerable. And perhaps that is one reason Egyptian magic was so precise. A ritual was not improvised because someone felt frightened. It depended on correct words, correct gestures, correct materials, and correct timing. The priest was not merely performing, he was maintaining a system. Like a sailor repairing a leak before the boat takes on water, he was helping hold back the chaos that pressed against the world every night. If you enjoy these old mysteries, there's also a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. It looks at the questions history has left behind, the ones that still refuse to stay quietly buried. The anti-Apep rituals also reveal something deeply human about Egyptian religion. The people who performed them knew the sun would rise most mornings. They had watched it happen all their lives, yet certainty did not make the ritual unnecessary. In a way, it made the ritual more important. The sun rose because order was being maintained. The world continued because gods, kings, priests, ancestors, and ordinary people all had roles within the great structure. You did not wait for disaster to prove chaos was real. You acted every day to prevent it. That idea can seem exhausting. Imagine believing that neglect, carelessness, or a missed ritual might give darkness an opening. But it could also be reassuring. The universe was dangerous. Yes, it was never permanently safe, yet people were not powerless. They had inherited words that had worked before. They could join Ra's defenders across the distance between Earth and the Duat. Even the dead needed those words. In funerary texts, the deceased often hoped to travel with Ra, or at least to avoid the dangers that threatened his boat. A successful afterlife was not passive rest. It involved knowledge. You needed to know the names of gates, the identities of guardians, the spells that repelled hostile beings. Knowledge was protection. Forgetting was danger. Apep, then, was not hidden merely because he lived beneath the horizon. He was hidden because chaos always is. It appears in the moment when a familiar pattern breaks. In the storm that comes at the wrong season. In illness, invasion, betrayal, panic, and darkness at noon. The Egyptians gave that fear a body, a serpent in the black water beyond the sky. But they also gave themselves an answer. Speak, remember. Repeat the old words, stand with the forces that keep the world from coming apart. And every dawn, when the sun returned over the eastern horizon, it offered the same quiet conclusion. The serpent had not won, not this time. But Apep was not the only Egyptian being whose power depended on moving where ordinary eyes could not follow. The next one did not lurk beneath the world, waiting to swallow light. It moved much closer than that. It could leave the body, wander freely, and perhaps return. Number 12. The mysterious bar. The wandering soul. After Apep, this may seem almost gentle. No giant serpent. No jaws opening beneath the sunboat. No monster waiting in the dark water beyond the horizon. Just a bird, but not an ordinary bird. The Egyptians imagined the bar as a human-headed bird, usually shown with the body and wings of a falcon or hawk, but with the recognizable face of the person who had died. Sometimes it wears a small wig, sometimes its hands reach down toward the mummy below. Sometimes it hovers over a tomb, a coffin or a pile of offerings, as if it has just returned from somewhere very far away. And that is what made it unsettling. The bar was not exactly a soul, at least not in the simple modern sense. When people today say soul, they often mean one invisible, permanent inner self, something that lives inside the body and then leaves at death. The Egyptians saw a person as something more complicated. You had a body, the cat. You had the ka, a kind of vital double that needed offerings of food and drink. You had your name, the Ren, which had to be remembered if you were to continue existing. You had your shadow, the Shut, and you had the bar. The bar was connected to personality, identity, movement, and presence. It was the part of you that could travel, the part that could go somewhere the body could not. And once a person died, that ability became enormously important. Because death, for the Egyptians, was not supposed to be a complete disappearance. It was a change of address. The dead entered the Duat, the dangerous and mysterious realm beyond ordinary sight. They faced gates, guardians, judges, rivers, fires, strange landscapes, and the possibility of becoming lost. They needed spells, names, protection, and proper burial. But even if they succeeded, they were not expected to remain sealed inside a tomb forever. Their bear could leave. This is why Egyptian tombs were not simply places where a body had been hidden away. They were homes, stations, meeting points between worlds. The mummy rested there. Offerings were brought there. Names and titles were carved there. Scenes of food, farming, music, family, boats, servants, and daily life covered the walls. And the bar could return there at night. According to many Egyptian funerary ideas, the bar made its journey back to the tomb. It came home to the body. It reunited with the mummy, or at least with the physical remains that had been carefully preserved against decay. This was one reason mummification mattered so much. If the body was destroyed, the dead person faced a terrifying problem. The bayar might still exist, perhaps. The kayar might still need nourishment. But the stable centre of the individual had been damaged. The person could become incomplete, unable to gather themselves back together. For the Egyptians, survival after death was not automatic. It had to be maintained. That is a very different idea from simply floating away into heaven. The dead needed a recognizable body. They needed a name. They needed food offerings. They needed relatives who remembered them. They needed spells written on coffins, papyrus, tomb walls, amulets, and sometimes directly on the wrappings around their bodies. Most of all, they needed to be able to return. Picture the strange rhythm of it. A tomb is closed. The desert outside has gone quiet. The living have left after bringing bread, beer, water, onions, meat, flowers, maybe incense. Deep inside, a wrapped body lies in darkness. The face is covered by a mask or protected within layers of linen. Nearby are small objects chosen for eternity. Amulets, jars, figurines, perhaps a painted coffin covered in words. And then in Egyptian imagination something moves. Not the body, the bar. It rises in bird form and travels through spaces that ordinary people cannot enter. It may move between the tomb and the world of the living. It may join the sun god on his journey. It may pass through the duat. It may visit sacred places. It may receive offerings. It may see the daylight again. Then, when the time comes, it returns. The human head mattered, because this was not just any bird flying through the Egyptian sky. It was someone, a father, a mother, a child, a priest, a scribe, a farmer, a king. The body had died, but the face remained recognizable. The person had not become anonymous. Their individual identity could still look back at the world. That is probably why images of the bar can feel so intimate. A bird is expected to be distant. It belongs to the sky, moving above human reach. But a human face changes everything. Suddenly the bird seems to know you. Suddenly it could be watching a house, a street, a temple courtyard, or a family making offerings for the dead. The boundary between living and dead becomes much less secure. A bird lands near a grave. Is it only a bird? A bird circles above a funeral procession. Is it only following the movement below? A bird appears at the window, on a wall, beside food placed out for an ancestor. Is it a natural creature doing what birds do? Or could it be someone who once belonged to the family? The Egyptians did not necessarily believe every bird was a wandering bar. That would be too simple. But their religious imagination made room for the possibility that a dead person could take bird-like form and move through the same world as the living. And that possibility made death feel close. Not close in the sense that the dead were always terrifying. Egyptian ancestors could be helpful. They could receive offerings, support descendants, and remain part of a household's moral and spiritual world. A well-provided-for-dead person was not necessarily a threat. But the dead also had needs. If their tomb was neglected, if their name was forgotten, if offerings stopped, if someone damaged their body or disturbed their burial, then the relationship could change. The dead might become restless. They might appear in dreams. They might send illness, bad luck, or complaints from beyond the grave. There are ancient Egyptian letters written to the dead, and they are among the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world. A living person might write to a deceased relative almost as if sending a message to a neighbour. They could ask for help. They could accuse the dead person of causing trouble. They could plead for protection against another dead spirit. The tone was sometimes respectful, sometimes desperate, and sometimes remarkably direct. "Why are you troubling me? Why have you allowed this sickness? Help your family. Defend me against the person who wrongs me." These letters tell us that the dead were not gone in the way we often imagine them gone. They remained involved, they had influence, they had identities, memories, relationships, and perhaps grievances. The bay gave that continuing presence a form with wings, and wings meant freedom. The dead person was no longer limited by the place where their body rested. A tomb could be built in the western desert, far from the noise of a city. Yet the bar could travel. It could move outward into the daylight, perhaps taking part in the renewed life of the cosmos. Some funerary texts express the hope that the dead person might go out by day, which is the title commonly given to the collection we know as the Book of the Dead. Going out by day sounds peaceful enough, but think about what it implies. The dead were not meant to remain still. They could emerge. They could pass through doors no living hand opened. They could fly over the desert. They could follow the sun. They could return to places they had known. And every night, when darkness settled over Egypt and the ordinary world became harder to see, they could come back to the tomb. This did not mean the Egyptians thought death was easy. Quite the opposite. The bar's freedom depended on preparation. Without the right rituals, without a preserved body, without protective knowledge, the dead could fail to travel safely. They could be trapped, hungry, forgotten, or transformed into something less fortunate. The ideal was not merely to survive death, it was to become effective beyond death. Egyptian funerary texts often used the word Ak for a blessed, transfigured spirit, one capable of acting with power among the gods. The bay was part of the process that allowed this transformation. It carried individuality into movement. It made it possible for the dead person to remain themselves, while crossing the impossible distance between tomb, sky, underworld, and memory. And perhaps that is why the human-headed bird was so hard to hide from. Apep hid beneath the horizon. Ammit waited in the hall of judgment. Medjed hid behind a shroud. But the bar could be anywhere there were wings against the light. It could leave the silence of a burial chamber and enter the living world without announcing itself. It did not need to break down a door. It did not need to rise from a grave in a body of rotting flesh. It only had to become a bird, lift into the air, and vanish into the enormous Egyptian sky. For a civilization that watched birds cross the Nile every day, that must have made the world feel crowded with unseen travellers. Not every movement overhead belonged to the dead, but perhaps some did, and if one of them had a human face, it might not have been a monster at all. It might have been someone trying to find the way home, and that is where we leave them, not trapped in some distant world of pyramids, gold masks, and museum glass. Not safely buried in the past, but moving through the Egyptian imagination in forms that could blend into ordinary life. A small guardian at the doorway, a pregnant hippopotamus beside the bed, 7 women arriving at a birth, a jackal at the edge of the desert, a wolf walking ahead on the road, a crocodile beneath the river surface, a storm shape crossing the empty land, a fever no one could explain, a wrapped figure hiding its face, a devourer waiting where the heart was weighed, a serpent moving through the darkness beneath the sun, and finally a bird with the face of someone who had died. That is the strange thing about this list. The Egyptians did not always imagine danger as something completely separate from the world they knew. Their most powerful beings were often hidden inside familiar things. A household object, an animal beside the Nile, a desert wind, a sickness, a dream, a bird overhead. The world was not divided neatly into the natural and supernatural. It was layered. A crocodile was a crocodile. It could also be Sobek's creature, or a sign of sacred power. A jackal could be a scavenger moving through the desert. It could also recall Anubis, guardian of the dead. A storm could be weather. It could also carry something of Set's violence, confusion, and force. To modernize, this can sound like superstition, but it was also a way of taking the world seriously. Ancient Egypt depended on the Nile, and the Nile gave life while also carrying danger. The desert protected Egypt from invaders in some directions, but it was also a place of heat, thirst, death, and burial. Childbirth brought new life, but it was terrifyingly risky. Disease could arrive without warning. Death could take a person from a household, while their memory, their name, and their unfinished relationships seemed to remain. The Egyptians lived close to realities that people today often push into the background. They knew that safety was fragile. They knew that the body could fail. They knew that the river could feed you and kill you. They knew that a person could disappear from sight without disappearing from the minds of those who loved them. So they gave these forces names. Bes was there for the dangers closest to home. Not a distant god who only mattered in a grand temple, but a strange little protector who belonged in bedrooms, workshops, and family life. He frightened danger away by looking dangerous himself. He was ugly in the way a guard dog can be ugly, because he was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to keep something worse outside. Taweret stood beside mothers and children, combining some of the most feared animals in Egypt into a guardian of vulnerable beginnings. A hippopotamus could crush a boat. A crocodile could drag someone under. A lion could tear apart prey. Yet Taweret turned these terrifying qualities toward protection. She represented the hope that strength could stand beside the weak. The Seven Hathors were more subtle. They did not hide in darkness or underwater. They appeared at the beginning of a life, perhaps at the moment when a newborn's future was still unknowable. They remind us that the Egyptians did not believe anyone entered the world completely free of fate. Some things might be shaped long before a person understood what was happening to them. Then came the guides of dangerous boundaries. Anubis in jackal form watched over the dead and the places where bodies were placed beyond the living city. Wepwawet, the opener of ways, moved ahead into uncertainty. Together, they represent a very Egyptian idea. Death was not simply an ending. It was a road, a difficult road full of gates, questions, enemies, and places where you could lose your way. Sobek belonged to another kind of boundary, the water's edge. Anyone who has watched a river knows that its surface can lie. It can look calm while deep currents move below. In ancient Egypt, that danger had teeth. Sobek was not merely a monster, and he was not merely a protector. Like the Nile itself, he contained both possibilities. He was power that could not be ignored, bargained with, or fully controlled. Set was even harder to place. He was the desert storm, the violent interruption, the outsider, the force that broke order apart. But Egyptian religion was rarely as simple as good gods against bad gods. Set could be dangerous, yes. He could murder Osiris and threaten the stability of the cosmos. But in some stories, he also defended the sun god against Apep. The same force that destroys can sometimes be used against a greater destruction. That is not a comfortable lesson, but it may be one of the oldest. The fiery messengers of Sekhmet brought the fear of invisible disaster into focus. When fever spread, when plague came, when suffering moved from home to home and nobody could see the cause, it was easy to imagine divine agents walking among the people. Not because the Egyptians lacked intelligence, but because they were trying to explain a terror that even modern medicine did not fully understand until very recently. Then there was Medjed, the hidden Smiter. Perhaps no being on this list better captures the unsettling Egyptian talent for making mystery feel personal. He was shown as a wrapped floating shape with eyes staring from beneath a covering. We know his name. We know that he could strike, but much of what he was meant to be remains uncertain. And somehow that uncertainty makes him more effective. A monster with a complete biography becomes familiar. A being with only a name, a shroud, and a threat remains hidden. If you have enjoyed this slow journey through ancient fears, strange gods, and unexplained things, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. It explores more of those questions that history leaves half open, the mysteries with clues, theories, and just enough uncertainty to keep you thinking long after the story ends. But in Egypt, some mysteries did have a clear purpose. Ammit waited at the judgment of the dead, where the heart could be weighed against the feather of At. She was not simply a creature that ate people. She was the final consequence of a life that had failed the test. If your heart was heavy with cruelty, dishonesty, violence, or disorder, then Ammit was waiting. And there was no escape after that. No second death, followed by another chance. No comfortable afterlife for the person who had destroyed the balance of the world. The image is brutal, a creature made from the most dangerous animals Egypt knew, devouring the heart of the guilty. But it also reveals what mattered in Egyptian ethics. Order mattered, truth mattered, fairness mattered. The way you treated other people mattered enough to be judged after death. Apep was different. Apep was not a bad person. He was not a criminal waiting for judgment. He was chaos on a cosmic scale, the serpent in the dark water, the enemy of the sun, the force that wanted the daily renewal of the world to fail. Every night the sun god entered danger. Every dawn was, in a sense, a victory that had to be won again. This is why Apep remains so powerful as an image. He was not only a monster beneath the horizon. He was the possibility that the light might not return, the possibility that order could collapse, the possibility that after all the rituals, all the prayers, all the labour of gods and humans, darkness might finally win. And yet, according to Egyptian belief, it did not. Not permanently. The sun rose, the boat continued. The world began again. Then there was the Ba, perhaps the quietest and most intimate being of all. The Ba did not hide by becoming monstrous. It hid by becoming familiar. A bird in the sky, a shadow passing over a tomb, a living face carried by wings. It reminded the Egyptians that death did not erase identity all at once. The dead remained connected to names, bodies, homes, offerings, and memories. They might journey far beyond the reach of the living, but they could also return. That final image changes the entire list, because not every hidden presence was an enemy. Some guarded the house, some protected mothers, some opened roads. Some punished injustice, some carried the dead between worlds. The ancient Egyptian universe was dangerous. Absolutely. But it was not empty. Everywhere there were powers watching, protecting, threatening, guiding, testing, and sometimes simply waiting to be remembered. Maybe that is why these beings still feel so alive. We can look at them as gods, demons, symbols, religious ideas, or reflections of the natural world. Different scholars will emphasize different meanings. Some details are clear from temple inscriptions, coffins, magical texts, and tomb paintings. Others remain uncertain, broken by time, translated from difficult language, or preserved only in fragments. But uncertainty is part of the experience. The Egyptians themselves knew that the world contained things people could not fully see. A shadow could conceal danger. A river could conceal jaws. A storm could conceal violence. A tomb could conceal a traveller with wings. And the dark beneath the horizon could conceal a serpent vast enough to swallow the sun. So perhaps the real question is not whether these beings literally walked among the ancient Egyptians. The better question is why people felt they might. Why did a household need bears at the door? Why did childbirth need Taweret near the bed? Why did the dead need Anubis, Wepwawet, spells, maps, names, offerings, and a returning bar? Why did the sun itself need protection every night? Because life was uncertain. Because the world was beautiful and dangerous at the same time. Because human beings have always looked at the places they cannot control and imagined something waiting there, at the bedside, in the reeds, on the road, in the storm, below the water, beyond the grave, and perhaps above us, flying silently home. If you enjoyed this journey, kindly like the video, subscribe for more slow history, ancient mysteries and stories to drift off to, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from tonight. It is always remarkable to see how far these old stories travel. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description. For now, rest easy. The jackals are far out in the desert. The crocodiles are beneath the dark water. The sun boat is still moving, and somewhere in the vast Egyptian sky, a small bird with a human face may still be trying to find the way home.